Hey guys, tonight we're slipping back into Victorian London, and you're about to step through the creaking doors of a workhouse. The air smells of soot and boiled cabbage, the kind of scent that clings to your clothes even after you've left. The walls rise high and gray, with tiny windows like narrow, watchful eyes. You probably heard whispers about these places, but walking in feels less like charity and more like crossing into a fortress. And to be honest, you probably won't survive this, at least not with your dignity intact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love it if you let me know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing at the threshold, and already you feel the weight of rules pressing down. An overseer eyes you as though you're more insect than human, deciding whether you're desperate enough to obey. A few other poor souls shuffle in beside you, their boots worn down to paper-thin leather. The building itself seems designed to intimidate. Long corridors that echo with the sound of boots, high ceilings that remind you of your smallness. You might think of a prison, and you're not wrong. Architects deliberately made these places severe, with the belief that comfort would only encourage laziness. Historians still argue whether this was cruelty by design or simply misguided moral zeal. Inside, your name disappears almost instantly. You're given a number, a ledger entry, a category stamped on your existence. The very air of the place feels heavy with rules, as though the walls themselves are whispering, "Obey, obey, obey." That's one of the cruel jokes about Victorian workhouses. They called them havens for the poor, but really, they were machines for breaking down individuality. Imagine walking into a government office today, only instead of paperwork, you're handed a uniform and told you'll live under surveillance for the rest of your life. Not exactly a warm welcome. You shuffle along a hallway lined with iron hooks, each holding garments identical in their dullness, scratchy gray wool uniforms that itch at the skin. Your own clothes, the last shreds of identity you had, are stripped away and replaced with something that makes you indistinguishable from the stranger next to you. If you are hoping to stand out, forget it. Everyone in here blends into the same drab blur, a mainstream historical fact. These uniforms were deliberately designed to be shapeless and practical, robbing residents of individuality and, in the minds of Victorian reformers, also of vanity. Quirky detail? Some workhouses even shaved your hair short, partly to control lice, partly to make you less attractive to anyone who might get ideas about romance. Speed dating, Victorian style, except the only spark is from static wool scratching at your arms. You pass a barred window and catch a glimpse of London outside. Just beyond the soot-stained glass lies the world you once knew. Muddy streets, chimney smoke curling up, the faint sound of horses clattering over cobblestones. Inside here, though, the silence is controlled, broken only by footsteps and the occasional barked order. The contrast is suffocating. You're led through a courtyard where other inmates, yes, that's really what they called them, shuffle about in groups, though never too freely. Workhouses had separate yards for men, women, and children, each designed so you couldn't so much as glimpse your spouse or child once you crossed the gate. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen from Roman Egypt? At least that had a bizarre sense of humor to it. Here, the joke is on you, and it's anything but funny. Your stomach grumbles, but you're not sure food will bring comfort. Rumors float about watery porridge, bread so hard it doubles as a doorstop, and the occasional scandal when officials accused a workhouse of serving inmates too much food. Imagine that, being punished for generosity. One famous case in Andover involved starving paupers so desperate they gnawed at rotting bones they were meant to crush for fertilizer. That scandal reached Parliament, sparking outrage and inspection. Historians still argue whether that was an isolated case of mismanagement or proof of a system designed to grind the poor down until they were literally chewing marrow out of desperation. Either way, you'd probably think twice before asking for seconds. The sound of iron keys rattling breaks your thoughts. An attendant marches by with a clinking ring that reminds you of a jailer. You glance around, noting the high barred gates, the watchful eyes, and you realize escape isn't really an option. Once you step into the workhouse, leaving again isn't as simple as walking out. It's a commitment, a surrender. You've traded freedom for survival. Even the architecture seems to push you down into submission. Cold stone walls leach the warmth from your skin. The ceilings are high enough to echo, yet there's no grandeur. Only a calculated sense of distance between you and anything resembling comfort. The Victorians liked order, and they built these institutions as physical sermons. Proof that poverty was a moral failing, corrected not with kindness, but with discipline. Imagine if today's unemployment offices made you live inside them, with all the fluorescent lights left buzzing 24 hours a day. That's about the level of welcome you're getting here. As you settle into this new world, the quiet dread deepens. Somewhere in the building, a bell clangs, and everyone around you stiffens like trained animals. That sound will rule your days from now on. Wake up, line up, eat, work, sleep, repeat. It's less a rhythm of life and more a drumbeat of survival. You're not quite a prisoner, but you're certainly not free. And yet, here you are, filing in like so many before you. Because outside these walls, hunger has sharper teeth than any overseer inside. Your first glimpse has already told you everything. This place was never meant to lift you up. It was meant to strip you bare, reduce you to compliance, and make you grateful for scraps. And as the doors close behind you with a dull thud, you realize you're not just in the workhouse now. The workhouse is in you. The clang of that bell echoes in your ears long after it fades, and already you sense how much power a simple sound will have over you. You shuffle along in the line, every step dictated by a schedule that you never agreed to, but must obey. This is the first full day of your life inside a Victorian workhouse, and it quickly becomes clear. Time is not your own anymore. You're marched into a long hall, the walls bare, the floorboards scuffed by countless boots before yours. An overseer reads from a ledger in a voice that could make even sunshine sound like a funeral. The rules are explained, though really they are more commandments carved into stone than mere guidelines. Wake at 5, wash in cold water, assemble at 6, work by 7, meals at rigid intervals, bed at 9. No questions, no exceptions. This strict rhythm wasn't accidental, a mainstream historical fact. The Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834 created workhouses precisely to discourage people from seeking relief unless they were truly desperate. The philosophy was that life inside had to be less eligible, a fancy phrase meaning worse than the lowest job outside. If you had any scrap of pride left, you'd choose the street over this timetable. Historians still argue whether the rigidity was a moral crusade against idleness, or simply a way to keep overcrowded institutions from collapsing into chaos. You feel the weight of the day settle on you. Bells ring not to invite, but to command. At each clang, bodies shuffle into motion. Eat, march, scrub, work, kneel. The bell is like a conductor, but the orchestra is an army of the beaten down. No violins, just the sound of coughs, clattering spoons, and weary sighs. The routines stretch into punishment. If you're late, you lose your meal. If you speak out of turn, you might be locked in a refractory cell, a bare room where silence presses on you like another kind of hunger. Even laughter is suspicious, as if joy is contraband. And heaven help you if you try to smuggle in a crust of bread for a friend. The rules insist on discipline, but sometimes they just feel like an elaborate game designed to remind you of your powerlessness. Yet the Victorians loved their timetables. Trains ran on them, factories ran on them, even morality seemed to run on them. The workhouse adopted this same obsession with the clock, believing structure would reform the poor into obedient citizens. But there's a quirky tidbit here. In some London workhouses, clocks were deliberately set 5 or 10 minutes fast, just to ensure nobody ever slipped behind. Imagine your boss today setting your phone ahead so you're never late, only you don't get to adjust it back when you leave. Your first work assignment comes quickly. No easing in, no gentle transition. After a plain breakfast, you're marched into a yard where men pick oakum, pulling apart old ropes into fibrous strands for reuse. The women are sent to laundry or kitchen duty, the children to scrub floors or carry water. Everyone is given a task not for efficiency, but because idleness itself was considered a sin. You tug at the rope fibers until your fingers blister, each strand prickling like needles. The overseer paces with the gait of someone convinced he alone holds the key to civilization. You catch glimpses of other punishments woven into routine. A man with sunken eyes stands against the wall for hours because he muttered during prayers. A woman is made to scrub the stone steps repeatedly, even after they shine. It's not about cleanliness. It's about breaking will. A joke, if you can call it that, surfaces in your mind. If misery were soap, this place would be spotless. At noon, the bell tolls again. Meals are short, quiet, and watched carefully. You eat quickly, knowing that hesitation might be mistaken for complaint. A few spoonfuls of broth, maybe a hunk of bread, swallowed in the same silence that cloaks the dormitories at night. You wonder if the bell is less a timekeeper and more a leash, pulling everyone along by the throat. And yet, as the day drags, you notice something unexpected. Routines, while suffocating, also shield you from thought. The predictability dulls the pain of hunger, the ache of loss. You don't have to decide anything, just obey, and the hours pass. Historians still argue whether some inmates found a grim comfort in this order, like prisoners who grow used to their chains. It's a debate that asks whether the system was entirely cruelty or whether it accidentally gave structure to lives that chaos had already shattered. Evening comes, and the bell tolls again, its sound bouncing off the stone walls like a drum beat of surrender. You file into prayers, your voice blending with others in hymns sung not from joy, but from weary obligation. You glance around the dim chapel hall, noticing faces half hidden in candlelight, faces that, like yours, have been pressed flat by routine. When lights are finally extinguished, you sink into the hard bedding of your dormitory. The day has been stripped of its individuality, every hour carved by bells into identical slices. Tomorrow will be the same, and the day after, and the day after that. And while part of you wants to rage against the monotony, another part of you feels strangely sedated, lulled by the clockwork cruelty of the place. You close your eyes, the clang of the bell still echoing in your mind, and you realize the workhouse doesn't just rule your body. It has begun to colonize your very sense of time. Morning comes not with the gentle warmth of sunlight, but with the bark of a bell and the scrape of boots against stone. You groggily rise from the hard cot, your back stiff from a night spent on straw so thin you might as well have slept on the bare floor. Already you miss your old clothes, ragged as they were. Because here in the workhouse, even your clothing has been claimed, replaced with coarse wool that scratches your skin with every movement. You shuffle into line with the others, each of you clad in nearly identical uniforms. The men wear drab jackets and trousers, the women rough cotton gowns, and the children miniature versions of the same. No bright colors, no ribbons, no touches of self-expression. It's as if the very concept of individuality has been scrubbed away, leaving behind a uniform army of the poor. Mainstream historical fact. Workhouse clothing was intentionally standardized, a way to strip away pride and make sure no one confused these places with charity. After all, if the garments had been decent, some Victorians feared people might actually want to be here, and no one could allow that. The itching of the fabric becomes a constant reminder of your status. You rub at your wrists, where the rough seams bite into your skin. Inmates whisper about the lice and fleas that thrive in these uniforms, passed from one body to another like unwelcome inheritance. Occasionally, the garments are washed, but more often than not, they are reused until they nearly fall apart. A quirky tidbit? Some records suggest that workhouse officials ordered bolts of cloth so coarse and cheap that even servants in wealthy households refused to use them for polishing rags. That's what you're wearing now. Fabric considered unfit to clean silverware. You glance down the line and notice the eerie sameness of it all. Men who once worked as carpenters, sailors, or clerks all look indistinguishable. Women who once stitched lace or sold flowers now wear the same shapeless gowns. Children who once chased hoops down the street now stand in silence, their curls shorn away, their small forms swallowed by cloth 2 sizes too big. It's a flattening of humanity, a deliberate erasure of identity. Historians still argue whether this was simply an attempt at hygiene and efficiency, or whether it was a symbolic punishment, a way of declaring, you are nobody now. And yet, the human spirit resists in tiny, almost invisible ways. You catch sight of a man who has stitched a faint design into his sleeve, so faint it would escape notice unless you looked closely. A woman hums quietly to herself, turning the monotony of uniforms into a background chorus for her own melody. A child's eyes glimmer mischievously as she ties a bit of twine around her wrist, as if to say, I still belong to me. These small acts won't change the rules, but they whisper a reminder. Identity is stubborn, even when dressed in rags. When you sit down for breakfast, You can feel the scratch of the fabric against the bench. You shift uncomfortably, noticing the way others tug at collars and cuffs. A joke comes to mind, the kind you wouldn't dare say aloud. If torture ever needed a uniform, this would do nicely. The meal in front of you is bland enough to match, and you realize how much of life here is designed not just to keep you alive, but to keep you forgettable. Later, you're herded into the workyard. The uniforms blur together in the weak light of morning, so much so that when you glance across the yard, it feels as though you're looking into a hall of mirrors, every figure a gray shadow of the next. Overseers pace along the perimeter, easy to spot in their better-tailored coats. They stand out precisely because you don't. At one point, you overhear two newcomers whispering about the clothes they lost. One had been a dock worker, proud of his heavy boots and thick jacket. Another clutched memories of a dress with faded blue ribbons worn on Sundays. Both are gone now, confiscated, stored, or perhaps sold off. The clothing you once wore marked your labor, your family, your personality. Now, all of that is swallowed by the workhouse uniform, which marks only your poverty. And yet, a strange thought nags at you. The sameness does create a kind of equality, doesn't it? In here, no one has finer clothes than anyone else. The ragged street sweeper and the failed shopkeeper look the same. Historians still argue whether this was an accidental leveling of class distinctions or simply a cruel erasure of personal dignity. Was the uniform a democratic garment or a shroud? The debate lingers, but in this moment, you don't feel particularly equal, just stripped bare. As the day wears on, you grow used to the constant irritation of the cloth against your skin. It's like an itch you can never quite scratch, a dull background noise for every task you perform. You wonder if the Victorians realized how effective it was, not just as clothing, but as a psychological reminder. Every tug at the collar, every scratch at the seam tells you you belong to the workhouse now. When evening finally comes and you shuffle back toward the dormitory, you glance once more at the rows of identical figures around you. The uniforms blur together in the dim candlelight, and for a moment you feel as though your own outline is fading too. It's a chilling sensation, as if the workhouse is slowly erasing not just your clothes, but your very sense of self. And yet, as you lie down and pull the coarse blanket over your shoulders, you find yourself clinging to a stubborn thought. Under the scratchy wool, beneath the imposed sameness, you are still you. The uniform may cover your body, but it cannot completely smother the memory of who you were before you walked through those doors. You wake again to the clanging bell, and if yesterday felt heavy, today presses down even harder. The thought of food teases at your mind. But inside the workhouse, food is hardly the right word. It's fuel, dispensed with the same warmth as coal shoveled into a furnace. As you shuffle toward the dining hall, your stomach growls with an impatience that knows it won't be rewarded. The room itself is long and bare, with wooden tables scarred by years of elbows and dull knives. A faint, sour smell hangs in the air. Cabbage boiled down to mush, mingling with the metallic tang of tin cups. You're handed a ladle of something pale and watery, gruel. The texture is thin, the taste bland, yet it's meant to be your breakfast. A crust of bread follows, its surface so hard it could probably break a tooth, a mainstream historical fact. Official workhouse diets were carefully measured and strictly limited. designed to provide just enough calories for survival, without the slightest hint of indulgence. Reformers believed generosity with food would encourage dependency, so starvation hovered just at the edge of every meal. You lift the spoon to your lips, and the lukewarm gruel dribbles down like tasteless paste. You chew the bread, wishing you had the teeth of a blacksmith. Around you, the scraping of spoons against bowls becomes a dull chorus, punctuated only by the occasional cough. No laughter, no chatter. Eating is not a social act here. It's a silent ritual, as though speaking might tempt someone to ask for seconds. Rumors ripple through the room like smoke. You hear whispers of the Andover scandal, when inmates grew so desperate during bone-crushing duty that they gnawed the marrow from rotting bones. That revelation sparked outrage across England, shaking Parliament itself. Historians still argue whether it was an isolated horror born from neglect, or whether it exposed the entire philosophy of workhouses as cruel to the core. Either way, you glance at your bowl and wonder if hunger could ever drive you that far. A quirky tidbit to chew on, literally. In some workhouses, officials debated whether potatoes were too indulgent. Imagine that. The humble spud, boiled into softness, deemed a luxury unfit for the poor. Instead, bread and gruel remained the staples, served with clockwork regularity. Variety? That was a word that lived only in the cook's dictionary, not on your plate. Lunchtime isn't much better. Perhaps a ladle of broth, floating with the faintest suggestion of vegetables. If you're lucky, a scrap of suet pudding, heavy, bland, but filling. Supper might be more bread, maybe cheese if the budget allowed. Day after day, the same meager offerings arrive, as predictable as the toll of the bell. You might joke quietly to yourself, at least you'll never waste time deciding what's for dinner, but the humor sours quickly when you realize your body is shrinking into the uniform's folds. The dining hall enforces silence, overseers prowling to catch even a murmur. If you so much as smile at a neighbor, you risk losing your already meager meal. You think of family dinners outside these walls, perhaps a noisy kitchen, the smell of meat roasting, a child's laughter, and the contrast cuts deeper than hunger ever could. Food is not simply sustenance, it's memory, community, comfort. And here, all of that has been boiled away with the cabbage. Sometimes you spot small rebellions. A child might squirrel away a crumb in their pocket, risking punishment for the chance to nibble later. An older man dips bread into his water, softening it enough to chew, disguising the act as if it were forbidden magic. These tiny acts of defiance are enough to remind you that hunger cannot smother ingenuity. Still, your body weakens. The days of hard labor stretch before you, powered only by thin gruel and crusts. You feel it in your bones, in the heaviness of your limbs. Workhouse diets may not kill you outright, but they make survival a slow, grinding battle. The goal is not to nourish, but to discipline, to remind you 3 times a day that your place in the world has been measured and rationed out by someone else. By evening, as you swallow the last stale bite of bread, your stomach still feels hollow. The ache has become constant, a quiet throb that hums in the background of everything you do. You lie down in your cot, hearing the faint snores of others around you, and your mind drifts toward fantasies of food you'll never taste here. Roasted meat, fresh fruit, even a simple potato baked until its skin crackles. You almost laugh at yourself. Luxury in this place is defined by a potato. And as you close your eyes, stomach growling, you realize the cruel genius of the workhouse diet. It doesn't just starve the body. It starves memory, starves joy, starves the sense that you deserve more. Every spoonful of gruel is another reminder that you've been reduced not only to survive, but to survive without wanting. By now, the rhythm of the workhouse has sunk into your bones like cold rain. But if you thought your days would pass quietly, just gruel, scratchy uniforms, and the occasional prayer, you were wrong. Because now comes the true engine of this place, labor. Back-breaking, spirit-flattening, finger-bleeding labor. The kind of work that doesn't build anything beautiful, only burns through human bodies like kindling. This morning, you're assigned to oakum picking. The task sounds almost quaint, like some sort of craft project. It isn't. You're handed a length of old tarred rope, heavy, foul-smelling, stiff as dried leather. Your job is to unravel it strand by strand, picking apart each fiber with your bare hands until it becomes a fluffy mass of hemp. That hemp will be used to caulk the hulls of ships, sealing them from the sea. A mainstream historical fact, oakum picking was one of the most common tasks in Victorian workhouses, especially for men. It was deliberately monotonous, chosen not for its usefulness alone, but for its soul-numbing qualities. The tar clings to your skin, black under your nails, sticky and impossible to scrub off. Your fingertips sting with each pull, tiny cuts blooming with the salt of your own sweat. You shift position on the bench, trying to ease the ache in your lower back, but there's no relief, only more rope. A mountain of it waits in the corner as if mocking your efforts. Around you, the room is filled with others doing the same. Heads bowed, hands moving in tired rhythm, no one speaking. Overseers patrol like crows, eyes sharp for signs of idleness. You glance up once and catch the glare of one. He taps his cane against his boot, just loud enough to remind you he's watching. You look back down quickly. In here, silence is safety, and it's not just oakum. Others are sent to break stones, literally smashing rocks into gravel for road work. Women scrub laundry until their hands prune and crack. Children haul buckets, sweep endless corridors, or turn cranks attached to nothing at all. Yes, really. Some workhouses invented tasks that had no purpose other than to keep hands busy and minds dulled. Historians still argue whether this was cruelty for cruelty's sake or a twisted form of discipline intended to teach the value of work. Either way, it didn't teach skills. It taught obedience. You hear stories whispered between shifts. A man in another ward crushed his hand between stones. A boy collapsed from exhaustion while hauling water up the stairs. There's no compensation, no rest. If you can move, you work. If you can't, you're punished. A quirky tidbit. Some workhouses actually measured how much oakum a person picked each day, setting minimum quotas. Fall short, and you might lose your meal. So yes, your dinner depends on how fast you can destroy rope. Victorian logic at its finest. Your body starts to rebel. Muscles cramp, shoulders knot. Your spine feels like it's being pulled in two directions. The tar gets into your eyes somehow, stinging them until they water. You think about modern jobs, boring office meetings, retail shifts with bad music, and they suddenly feel like luxury resorts. You almost laugh, but stop yourself. Laughter here is suspicious. Laughter implies you're not suffering properly. At lunch, your hands are too sore to grip the spoon. You cradle it awkwardly, trying not to wince, as you bring the thin broth to your lips. Across the table, someone else's fingers are wrapped in cloth strips, makeshift bandages for the cuts. No one comments. Pain is as common here as bread. By mid-afternoon, your mind begins to wander. You imagine what it would be like to work on something that mattered, carving wood into furniture, stitching clothes, planting crops. But here, the tasks are deliberately meaningless. The work isn't about production. It's about submission. Historians still argue whether this moral labor ever truly reformed anyone or if it simply broke spirits until they fit neatly back into society's forgotten corners. The day stretches on. You keep picking at the rope, fiber by fiber, your hands moving on autopilot. Time blurs. You don't even hear the bell at first, just feel the room shift as others begin to stand. Finally, it's over. The oakum is gathered into sacks, weighed and recorded. Your quota is met. Barely. No punishment today, but no praise either. In here, survival is its own reward. You trudge back to the dormitory, hands raw, back aching, the smell of tar clinging to your clothes like a second skin. Even after washing, cold water only, of course, the black stains remain, a reminder of the day etched into your body. You lie on your cot, staring at the ceiling, and wonder how many more days you can endure this. A joke floats up in your mind, bitter but oddly comforting. Congratulations! You're now a professional rope destroyer. Too bad it doesn't pay. As you drift toward sleep, your hands twitch with phantom movements, still picking at invisible strands. Even in rest, the work doesn't stop, and that's the point. In the workhouse, labor isn't just something you do. It's something that seeps into you, rewires your muscles and your mind, until you're not just picking oakum. You are oakum, pulled apart, fiber by fiber, until nothing remains but something the world can patch its ships with and forget. The bell wakes you again, its metallic clang rattling through the dormitory like a cruel joke. But today feels different, not because the routine has eased, it hasn't, but because you start to notice the smallest figures moving about the hall. Children, their bare feet slap against the stone floors as they shuffle into line, uniforms hanging from their thin frames. Some can't be more than 6 or 7 years old, and yet they already wear the dull expression of people much older. You follow them into the yard, where tasks are handed out as though childhood itself were an inconvenience that needed tidying away. Some are given brushes to scrub endless corridors. Others carry buckets heavier than their arms seem designed to hold. A few are dispatched to the oakum room, their tiny fingers deemed perfect for plucking apart stubborn rope fibers. A mainstream historical fact: Victorian workhouses often relied on child labor, and even the youngest inmates were put to work. Officials argued it built discipline and prepared them for future employment. The reality? It stole their childhoods before they had a chance to begin. You watch a boy straining under the weight of a water bucket. The liquid sloshes, soaking his uniform, and an overseer scolds him for clumsiness. He doesn't cry. Maybe he's learned it's safer not to. His arms tremble as he continues forward. Beside him, a girl kneels with a brush, scrubbing the same patch of floor over and over, as if dirt itself has become a phantom enemy. She hums a little tune under her breath, soft enough to escape notice. But you catch it. A lullaby, perhaps, remembered from outside. The rules bite hardest here. Families are separated upon entry, fathers in one ward, mothers in another, children divided still further. You imagine the shock of being torn from your parents, ushered into a dormitory where every bed is filled with strangers. Historians still argue whether this separation was meant to prevent collusion, maintain order, or serve as a deliberate form of punishment. Whatever the reasoning, the effect was devastating. Children grew up in institutions that treated them more like factory workers than sons or daughters. You're assigned to help in the laundry today, where children shuffle in carrying piles of wet linen nearly as large as themselves. The air is thick with steam and soap, but the smell doesn't disguise the exhaustion etched into their small faces. They bend, lift, scrub, all without complaint. One boy coughs harshly, doubled over, but the work doesn't stop. A quirky tidbit. In some workhouses, laundry duty was so brutal that children nicknamed the wash tubs the devil's ponds. You look at their red, raw hands, and you can see why. At mealtime, the children sit in long rows, bowls of gruel before them, no chatter permitted. You notice the way their legs dangle above the floor, not yet long enough to reach, and the image strikes you. It's as if they're suspended between two worlds, too young for the burdens placed upon them, yet denied the innocence they deserve. The bread looks even harder in their small hands, yet they gnaw at it all the same, too hungry to care. One boy dares to whisper to his neighbor something about sneaking a crumb into his pocket for later. The overseer's cane smacks the table, and the sound reverberates through the hall like thunder. Everyone stiffens. The boy lowers his head, cheeks flushing, but he isn't struck further, at least not this time. The message is clear. Even friendship is a risk here. You think about the wider world. Outside the walls, wealthy families debate over nursery decorations and hire governesses for their children. Inside, these young ones are treated as miniature adults. Their worth measured in labor, completed. Historians still argue whether workhouse schooling, rudimentary lessons in reading, writing, and religious instruction offered any real benefit, or if it was simply another tool of control. The truth likely falls somewhere between. Education did exist, but it was laced with discipline, morality tales, and the constant reminder that poverty was a personal failing. As afternoon stretches on, you see fatigue weigh down every small body. A boy's head nods as he scrubs, only to be jerked awake by the snap of an overseer's voice. A girl's fingers bleed from rope fibers, but she tucks them behind her back, hoping no one notices. Even play, the natural escape of children, is stripped away. The yards are bare, the rules rigid. If joy exists here, it must be smuggled in the form of whispered songs and fleeting smiles. And yet, resilience flickers in small moments. You spot two boys sharing a glance, one rolling his eyes after the overseer passes, the other suppressing a grin. You see a girl slip her crust of bread to a younger child, so subtle it almost escapes notice. Humanity persists, even in miniature. When the bell rings for evening prayers, the children file into the chapel, voices high and thin as they sing hymns. The sound echoes strangely in the cavernous space, innocence layered over despair, like candlelight flickering in a storm. You join in, your own voice blending with theirs, and for a moment the harmony almost feels like hope. But as you return to the dormitory, You see the rows of tiny beds, each filled with a child who should be dreaming of play, not survival. You realize that inside the workhouse, childhood itself is just another resource to be consumed, another commodity to be worn down until nothing remains. You lie awake, listening to the soft snores and occasional whimpers of the children around you, and you think, the workhouse doesn't just steal futures. It steals the very years that should never belong to anyone else but the child who lives them. The first thing you notice this morning isn't the clang of the bell, but the gnawing ache in your stomach. Hunger has been with you since you entered the workhouse, but today it feels sharper, as if your body has decided to rebel against the monotony of thin gruel and dry bread. You shuffle into the dining hall with the others, the smell of boiled oats greeting you like an unfunny joke. Bowls are slapped down in front of each person. You peer into yours, the same gray gruel, watery and clinging reluctantly to the spoon. You taste it anyway, because hunger makes even disappointment worth swallowing. The texture is thick at the bottom, thin at the top, and carries the faint flavor of smoke from the kitchen fires. Bread follows, a single slice, coarse, brown, and as heavy as stone. You try to chew, jaw working like a machine, and wonder how long until your body gives up on resisting. A mainstream historical fact. Workhouse meals were deliberately bland and meager. Authorities argued that providing too much food would attract people rather than deter them. The policy was one of deterrence, not care. People weren't supposed to want to stay, and yet here you sit, forced by poverty into eating what no one outside would willingly choose. Across from you, a man dips his bread into his gruel to soften it. He chews with slow determination, his eyes unfocused, as though eating were a task no different from scrubbing or breaking stones. Beside him, an older woman hides a crust in her apron pocket, maybe for a child later, or perhaps for herself when hunger claws at her again during the night. The overseer paces between tables, cane tapping the floor in a rhythm meant to discourage any sense of fellowship. Conversation is forbidden. Meals are to be eaten in silence, punctuated only by the scrape of spoons and the occasional cough. You feel the weight of eyes on you, reminding you that even this most basic act, eating, is not private here. The fringe fact slips into your mind like an odd garnish. In some workhouses, the bread was rumored to be mixed with ground-up bones to make it stretch further. There's no solid proof of this, but the very idea hints at the suspicion inmates felt toward what they were fed. You glance at your slice, half tempted to break it apart and search for something sinister within its crumbs. Instead, you eat, because imagining only makes the hunger worse. After breakfast comes work again, and with it, the second round of meals. Dinner, as they call it, is served at midday. Potatoes boiled until their skins split, sometimes accompanied by a thin soup. If you're lucky, a bit of meat floats in the broth, but more often it's just water flavored by bones. Still, the warmth comforts you in a strange way. You close your eyes as you sip, imagining flavors that aren't there, herbs, butter, maybe even the impossible luxury of salt. Historians still argue whether the strictness of these meals was about economy or ideology. Was it truly about saving money, or was it designed to teach the poor that they didn't deserve more than bare subsistence? The answer, like the gruel itself, is murky and unsatisfying. By evening, your body has grown used to expecting little. Supper arrives, often just bread and cheese, if cheese is available. Sometimes only bread. You chew mechanically, thinking about how people outside the walls enjoy roast beef, pies, puddings dripping with syrup. You picture them dining by candlelight, laughter spilling into the night air, while here, candles are snuffed early and laughter is a distant memory. But the human imagination is stubborn. As you chew your crust, you catch someone at the far end of the hall whispering a recipe to himself. Something about goose fat, onions, and pastry. He mouths the words like a prayer. It's absurd, but you realize it's also a form of rebellion. To imagine flavor in a place designed to strip taste away. The quirks don't stop there. You remember hearing about inmates who would squirrel away potato skins, drying them under mattresses until they could be nibbled secretly as though they were sweets. Hunger makes inventors of everyone. You glance at your neighbor's bowl and see her scraping every last bit, licking the spoon as if it held honey instead of porridge. Outside the hall, the kitchens are a world of their own. Fires roar, water boils, and cauldrons simmer with endless oats. But the workers there, often inmates themselves, know better than to expect scraps. Everything is measured, accounted for, rationed. You can almost feel the weight of scales tipping, ensuring not a crumb too many finds its way into undeserving hands. Even so, rumors circulate. A child swears he once saw a cook slip a potato to a starving boy. Another tells you a story about a kind matron who smuggled in sugar lumps during Christmas. You want to believe these tales, even if they're myths, because myths taste better than the meals themselves. Later, when your belly groans with emptiness, you lie awake thinking about food. Your imagination wanders toward roasted apples dripping with caramel or thick slices of bread slathered in butter. You remember street vendors outside these walls, selling roasted chestnuts in winter, their smoky scent carrying down alleyways. That scent never reaches the workhouse. Here, the air smells only of soap, stone, and the faint tang of boiled oats clinging to your clothes. Still, hunger binds you to everyone else here. Each person knows the ache, the constant calculation of how to stretch one bite longer, how to trick the body into feeling full, and strangely, that shared deprivation becomes a kind of unity. You glance around the hall during meals and realize this is what survival looks like when stripped bare of flavor, reduced to necessity alone. Tomorrow, the same gray bowls will be waiting, and tomorrow you'll lift the spoon again because in the workhouse, food isn't about pleasure, it's about proving you're still alive, one tasteless mouthful at a time. You awaken to the sound of coughing. It echoes through the dormitory like a grim hymn, each wheeze and hack overlapping until the air feels thicker than the straw you sleep on. You pull your blanket tighter, though it's thin and scratchy, and try to ignore the raw burn in your own throat. The truth is simple. Sickness in the workhouse is as common as hunger, and sometimes it's harder to escape. The air is cold, damp, and always a little sour. Moisture clings to the walls, and when the fires in the hearth die down, the chill creeps in with merciless patience. People around you are pale, thin, and often hunched, their bodies already battered by poor diet and endless labor. All it takes is one fever, one cough, one infected wound, and illness spreads like wildfire through this crowded place. The mainstream fact is stark. Victorian workhouses were breeding grounds for disease. Overcrowding, poor sanitation, and malnutrition meant that conditions like tuberculosis, cholera, and typhus thrived here. Doctors did visit, but their treatments often amounted to little more than herbal syrups, bleeding, or tonics laced with alcohol. Sometimes the cure was worse than the illness. You drag yourself toward the infirmary, or as some call it, the workhouse hospital. The room smells faintly of vinegar and damp linen, an attempt at cleanliness that never quite succeeds. Rows of narrow beds line the walls, each filled with someone groaning or shivering beneath thin sheets. A nurse moves briskly between them, spooning medicine into open mouths. The medicine tastes bitter, almost metallic, and you wonder whether it helps or simply reminds you that help is meant to exist. Fringe fact time. In some workhouses, leeches were still used to balance the humors, a medieval holdover that feels more like torture than treatment. Imagine lying weak with fever only to have a squirming parasite attached to your skin in the name of health. You glance down at your own arm, half expecting to see the telltale trails of leech bites, though you've been spared so far. Historians still argue whether the workhouse infirmaries were genuine attempts at care or merely warehouses for the dying. Were they hospitals in spirit or simply a way to isolate sickness from the main body of inmates? The question lingers in your head as you watch a boy no older than 10 curl into himself, face flushed with fever, his mother stroking his hair helplessly beside him. There's a strange rhythm to sickness here. You notice how it reshapes daily life. Work slows when too many are unwell, but the tasks don't vanish. The healthy must work harder, filling the gaps left by the bedridden. Meals are brought into the infirmary, but they're the same tasteless fare, only softer, boiled to mush so weak mouths can manage. Still, small moments of humanity sneak in. The nurse, weary but gentle, adjusts blankets without being asked. An older man hums softly to calm a frightened child. Even sickness cannot erase all kindness, though it often buries it under layers of pain. At night, the infirmary is eerily quiet, broken only by labored breaths and occasional cries. You think about the outside world, how people there fight sickness too, but with family, warmth, and perhaps a physician who knows their name. Here, you're just one more frail body in a long row of beds. And yet, stories drift among inmates. A man claims he once recovered fully in the workhouse hospital, treated so well he returned to labor stronger than before. Another swears the nurses secretly brewed hot broth during the worst epidemics, slipping it to patients despite the rules. You want to believe these stories, even though most people know the truth. Sickness rarely lets go easily here. You cough again, the sound sharp in your chest, and wonder how many of these beds have already been occupied by ghosts. You don't ask out loud. Some questions are better left unspoken in a place where death hovers so near. And yet, even in this dim ward, you find yourself laughing quietly at one absurd detail. Victorians believed fresh air cured almost anything, so sometimes windows were flung open in the dead of winter to ventilate disease. You imagine lying feverish while icy drafts sweep the room, shivering not just from illness, but from the cure itself. No wonder the coughs never stop. You tuck yourself tighter under the covers and listen as the coughing resumes its midnight chorus. The infirmary feels less like a place of healing and more like an echo chamber of human frailty. Still, You breathe, you endure, and you wait. Because in the workhouse, survival itself is a kind of medicine, and each day you last is proof you're not yet among the forgotten. The clang of the morning bell jolts you awake, though your body aches from the fever that never quite leaves. You shuffle into line anyway because, sickness or not, the workhouse doesn't pause for long. Religion takes center stage today, though not in the soft, comforting way you might hope. No, here faith is less about consolation and more about control. You march with the others into the chapel, a long, bare hall with wooden benches polished smooth by generations of weary bodies. The air smells faintly of damp stone, candle wax, and dust. Sunlight filters through high windows, cutting the gloom with stripes of pale gold, though the warmth never quite reaches you. At the front stands the chaplain, black robe flowing, Bible in hand, voice booming as if trying to drown out the quiet rebellion that simmers in every heart here. Mainstream fact: every workhouse was required by law to have a chapel and to hold regular religious services. Attendance wasn't optional. Whether you were devout, indifferent, or secretly skeptical, you sat through sermons that hammered home obedience, humility, and gratitude. Gratitude, that is, for the meager life you were permitted here. You sit stiffly, back aching from the hard bench, as the chaplain thunders on about sin, idleness, and God's divine punishment for the poor. His words feel less like comfort and more like shackles. You notice the way children squirm beside their mothers, their eyes glazing over, too tired to care about eternal salvation. One boy stifles a giggle when the chaplain's voice cracks, and a matron immediately silences him with a sharp glare. And here's the fringe tidbit. Some chaplains went so far as to argue that poverty itself was proof of moral failing. In other words, your hunger wasn't bad luck. It was God's way of scolding you. Imagine being told that your empty stomach is your own fault, while the wealthy nod approvingly from their pews outside the workhouse walls. A cruel theology indeed. Historians still argue whether religion in the workhouse was genuine moral care or simply another tool of discipline. Was it meant to soothe souls or to remind inmates of their place in the cosmic hierarchy? The sermons are structured like chains. Sin leads to suffering, suffering to humility, humility to obedience. Somewhere in that loop, you're meant to accept your lot. As you sit there, you notice something else. How religion seeps into every corner of the workhouse day. Meals begin with prayers. Labor is framed as penance. Silence during rest hours is said to encourage contemplation. Even when you're picking oakum until your fingers bleed, you're told to see it as a form of spiritual cleansing. That's one way to rebrand misery, you suppose. Still, not every chaplain was a tyrant in robes. Some, against all odds, tried to help. There are whispered stories of priests smuggling extra bread to starving children or bending rules to reunite families briefly at Christmas. Small mercies in a system designed to break people. You cling to those rare rumors because they remind you that faith doesn't always equal control. It can also be defiance against cruelty. The sermon drones on, the chaplain's voice rolling like distant thunder. Your mind wanders, and you imagine how different this could feel. Perhaps, in another world, faith could be warm bread shared at a table, or hymns sung with joy, or a candlelit prayer whispered for strength. Here, it feels more like being told off by God Himself for daring to exist in poverty. And yet, there's a sly humor buried in the whole ordeal. One woman beside you mutters the prayers just a beat too late, deliberately mocking the rhythm. Another man, lips barely moving, mouths the words of a bawdy song instead of the Lord's Prayer. These small acts of irreverence ripple through the benches like tiny rebellions. You nearly laugh, though you smother it with a cough, because laughter here is as forbidden as dissent. By the time the service ends, your legs are stiff, your spirit heavy, and your stomach growling. The chaplain dismisses you with a stern reminder of God's watchful eye. As you file out, you wonder whether that eye ever notices the hunger, the cold, the endless drudgery, or only the failures of those enduring them. Still, as the day continues, you find yourself humming one of the hymns under your breath. The tune, stripped of the lecture, is oddly soothing. Maybe faith survives despite the workhouse, not because of it. Or maybe it's just the rhythm of the song giving your tired steps something steady to follow. Either way, you keep moving, because in the workhouse, even religion is something to endure. The day drags on, but something shifts in the air. Today is about the staff, the wardens, the masters, and all those who run this strange institution you've been forced into. You might imagine them as shadowy villains in top hats and frock coats, twirling mustaches while laughing at your misery. The truth, as usual, is both duller and crueler. They're ordinary people, given a little power in a place where power means everything. The master is the figure you notice first. He's not necessarily cruel by nature, but the job seems to mold him into something stiffer than oakum rope. His duty is to keep order, account for costs, and make sure no one gets too comfortable. He wears a coat that always looks just slightly better than anyone else's, but you can see the stress lines on his forehead. His presence is like an iron key, cold, necessary, and meant to lock people in place. Mainstream historical fact: every workhouse had a master and matron who essentially acted like governors. They lived on site, controlled everything from food rations to punishments, and oversaw the separation of men, women, and children. Their word was law inside these walls. The matron, meanwhile, handles the daily running of the house, especially the women and children. She has an eagle eye for disorder, and she can spot a child slouching or a woman whispering across the dormitory faster than you can blink. Some matrons are remembered as tyrants, handing out punishments with relish as though misery were a spice to sprinkle generously. Others, though rarer, were described as stern but fair, even offering a kind word when no one was listening. And then there are the warders, the low-ranking staff. Picture underpaid guards with clipboards and tempers, men who might take out their own frustrations on those weaker than themselves. They pace the workrooms like wolves, barking orders, keeping you moving when you slow down from fatigue. "Pick faster," one might shout as you try to untangle oakum with bleeding fingers. Their boots echo against the stone, reminders of who is in charge. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some staff weren't much better off than the inmates. A few warders had once been inmates themselves, or at least hovered on the edge of poverty. The pay was meager, the hours long, and the reputation low. Imagine the irony. Someone enforcing the very rules they once hated, just to avoid ending up back in line beside you. Historians still argue whether the cruelty of workhouse staff came from their personal failings or the system itself. Were masters and matrons naturally unkind people, Or did the rigid punishing structure force them into harshness? Perhaps it was both. After all, when you're paid to enforce rules written by the cold pen of bureaucracy, kindness becomes a liability. There's a rhythm to their power. The master calls inspections. The matron corrects posture. The warders bark orders, and the inmates shuffle along like parts of a machine. Every cog has its place. If one squeaks or slows, the overseers apply oil, or, more often, pressure. Still, the human cracks show. You've seen the master rub his temples when the accounts don't balance, muttering about too much bread wasted. You've seen the matron secretly dab at her eyes after a particularly harsh punishment she was forced to give. Even the warders sometimes let their voices soften when they think no one else is listening. It's a reminder that the system grinds everyone, not just the poor souls trapped in its gears. One small joke makes its way through the dormitories. The master's tea is just as weak as ours. He just gets more of it. You can't say it aloud, but it makes you smile. Humor, even whispered in the dark, is another way to strip a little authority from the people holding the keys. The staff's lives in their own way are bound by the same walls. They eat better, sleep warmer, and enjoy authority, yes, but they're also trapped in roles that require them to be feared rather than respected. When the bell rings for meals, even the master can't ignore it. When the parish board sends an inspector, even the matron stiffens, suddenly aware she is just another cog watched from above. By nightfall, as you hear the warder's boots fading down the corridor, you reflect on this odd balance. Power here is fragile, brittle, like old glass. A careless word, a moment of weakness, and even the strictest overseer could tumble down the same social ladder that placed you here. It doesn't make your own suffering easier, but it does paint the master's polished boots and the matron's severe glare in a different light. After all, authority in the workhouse is just another mask, and masks can slip. The candlelight flickers in the corridor, and you hear voices echoing through the thin walls. Voices not of the inmates, but of outsiders. Tonight, the focus shifts beyond the daily grind of rules and overseers. You catch whispers of scandal, of secrets that slipped through cracks and landed in newspapers or on the desks of reformers. The workhouse might seem like a sealed fortress, but it's amazing how often the truth leaked out. You might think no one cared what happened behind these walls, but Victorian London loved nothing more than a scandal. Workhouses, meant to be pillars of morality and thrift, sometimes became stories that sold papers and stirred debates in Parliament. Picture a reporter sneaking into a ward, quill in hand, scribbling notes about thin porridge or brutal punishments. The public gasped over these tales, sometimes with outrage, sometimes with voyeuristic delight. Mainstream historical fact. One of the most notorious scandals was the Andover Workhouse in the 1840s. Inmates there were so starved they reportedly gnawed on rotting animal bones they were meant to crush for fertilizer. The story broke into the national press, causing public uproar and parliamentary inquiries. Suddenly, everyone had an opinion about workhouses, and reforms became unavoidable. Of course, not every scandal was so dramatic. Sometimes it was petty corruption, masters skimming funds, matrons pocketing extra bread, warders demanding bribes for small privileges, a half-rotten potato sold back to the poor at twice its worth. Other times, the scandals were tragic. A child beaten too severely, an old man left to die unnoticed. Once such stories spread, The workhouse became less a symbol of help for the poor and more of cruelty wrapped in official paperwork. Here's your quirky tidbit. Victorian Londoners were morbidly fascinated by workhouse deaths. Notices often appeared in newspapers listing the cause of death of paupers, and people would read them the way we scroll true crime podcasts today. The grim tally of smallpox, cholera, or general debility became part of the public conversation. For some readers, it was a scandal. For others, grim entertainment over breakfast. Historians still argue whether the press exaggerated these scandals to sell papers or whether they revealed the true systemic rot at the heart of the poor law. Was Andover an exception or just the most visible tip of an iceberg of cruelty? You're left wondering, especially as you chew your crust of bread, whether your own workhouse might someday appear in headlines too. Imagine for a moment the inspector's visit. He walks through the halls with his notebook, peering into dormitories, sniffing at stew pots. Everyone straightens up, and the staff suddenly play the role of kindly caretakers. "Oh, yes, the children eat very well," the matron says, standing by bowls of gruel that somehow look thicker than usual today. The inspector scribbles a note, frowns slightly, and moves on. You think, if only he had come yesterday, when the stew was just cloudy water and a floating onion skin. And yet, inspectors and reporters could only do so much. Their reports often gathered dust, their warnings softened by committees more worried about costs than compassion. The outrage would flare up, reforms would be promised, and then, like candle smoke, it would fade, leaving you and others still waiting for change that rarely arrived. But scandal had another effect. It made the workhouse famous in a way you never wanted. Imagine someone passing by on the street and whispering, "That's the place from the papers, isn't it? The one where they starve the inmates." You are no longer invisible poverty. You are a curiosity, a story people gossip about over tea. It adds another layer of shame, as though you are part of a sideshow no one asked to perform in. Still, gossip had its power. Some stories stirred enough outrage to spark reforms. Slight increases in rations, better bedding, or stricter oversight of masters. Others served as cautionary tales for parishes who wanted to avoid embarrassment. And in the quiet of your dormitory, you cling to the small hope that perhaps tomorrow another scandal will light a fire under Parliament and improve your daily bread. At night, when you hear the rustle of newspapers being read aloud in the staff room, you can almost imagine your story traveling beyond these walls. A sentence here, a description there, ink pressed onto paper, carried into the hands of strangers. The scandals may embarrass the masters, but for you, they are proof that the world is watching, even if only through a keyhole. Morning comes, and with it the hum of whispers you can't quite ignore. Talk travels quickly in a place where there's little else to pass the time. But today, the whispers aren't about the next meal or the bell schedule. They're about scandal that has already escaped these walls. Once you've lived in a workhouse for long enough, you realize you're not just a resident. You're part of a fragile performance. And when the curtain slips, the world outside gets a peek at something uglier than anyone dared to imagine. The 19th century loved drama, and London newspapers were happy to provide it. They weren't just content with stories of Parliament and industry. They craved lurid detail, the kind that made readers choke on their morning toast. And few settings offered such raw material as the workhouse. Imagine headlines that screamed of cruelty to the poor or starvation in Andover. You'd be both horrified and secretly thrilled to see your suffering inked in bold letters. Take the Andover scandal. It's one of those stories people still repeat today because it's so grotesque. Inmates so hungry they gnawed marrow from rotting bones meant for grinding into fertilizer. The shock wasn't just in the act. It was in realizing that starvation could exist within a system designed to provide relief. It forced Parliament to take action, embarrassed poor law guardians, and sparked fiery debates in the press. Suddenly, the workhouse wasn't hidden. It was laid bare for judgment. But scandals didn't always break with such ferocity. Sometimes they trickled out through personal accounts. Letters from former inmates, tales carried by relatives who refused to stay silent, even notes smuggled to sympathetic reporters. Mainstream historical fact. Social reformers like Charles Dickens and Henry Mayhew used these accounts to shine light on the system, weaving them into essays, novels, and studies that shaped public opinion. Dickens, who visited workhouses himself, painted them in such bleak strokes that even middle-class readers couldn't help but shudder. Then there are the quiet scandals, the ones never splashed across front pages but whispered at tea tables. A matron who withheld extra bread to sell for her own profit. A master who used inmates as free servants in his private rooms. A doctor who prescribed laudanum for every ailment because it was cheaper than food. Each tale might have seemed too small for national outrage, yet together they built a portrait of systemic neglect. Your quirky tidbit. Some workhouses kept their scandalous moments out of the papers by bribing local printers not to run stories. Imagine slipping a few coins into a typesetter's pocket with a hushed, "Perhaps tomorrow's issue doesn't need that piece about our missing rations." It's the Victorian version of a PR crisis management team. Historians still argue whether these exposés actually improved conditions in the long term, or whether they just provided brief entertainment for readers who loved to gasp and clutch their pearls before turning the page to something else. Did the scandals truly change hearts, or did they simply reinforce the comforting belief that corruption was somewhere else, not in every parish? From your perspective inside the workhouse, scandals are both terrifying and hopeful. Terrifying because they remind you how vulnerable you are to public spectacle. You might become that poor wretch described in a sensational article. Hopeful because they prove that sometimes, just sometimes, the world beyond these walls is listening. Picture the scene. The master pacing furiously after reading a damning report in the Times. He scolds the staff, tightens control, maybe even improves the stew for a week just to cover appearances. For once, you feel as though the pen truly is mightier than the ladle, and yet the weight of memory lingers. Inmates who lived through these exposures remember the mix of shame and relief, the sting of being reduced to a headline, but also the spark of hope that the scandal might force better treatment. In the silence of the dormitory at night, you wonder, will the next scandal be the one that changes everything? Or will it fade into the background noise, just another tale swallowed by history's appetite for the dramatic? For now, the whispers grow louder. Every time the door creaks open and a stranger walks the halls, you wonder if they're here to observe, to record, to expose. The workhouse might be a cage, but its bars are not impenetrable. Words slip through, scandals ignite, and sometimes the outside world looks back at you with shocked eyes. Night doesn't bring rest so much as restless plotting. When you've endured the monotony of bells, the grinding of stones, and the taste of the same watery broth day after day, your imagination starts to wander. Escape feels impossible, but the idea glimmers in the back of your mind like a candle stubbornly refusing to go out. After all, what's the worst that can happen? Being caught and dragged back. You're already in the lowest place society has to offer. Workhouses were built to be cages, but cages can't always hold determined people. You'd hear the stories whispered in corners, passed around like contraband sweets. Someone scaling a wall under cover of darkness, another disappearing during an errand, a boy wriggling under a loose gate hinge. Most of these tales ended badly, with the escapee caught, punished, and forced back to start the cycle again. But a few succeeded, and those rare victories grew into legends. Mainstream historical fact. Records show repeated instances of inmates absconding. Guardians reported it with indignation, noting escapes in official ledgers as though they were affronts to order itself. Men often ran to find day labor in the city, while women sought relatives or charity outside the poor law system. Some simply vanished, leaving behind no trace but an empty bed. But rebellion wasn't only about physical escape. Sometimes resistance took quieter forms. You might work just slowly enough to irritate the overseer, or swap duties with another inmate to avoid the worst tasks. Once in a while, inmates staged collective protests, refusing meals, chanting grievances, or even pelting the master with scraps of bread. They weren't organized revolutions, but they were reminders that people could still push back, even in chains of poverty. Quirky tidbit, one workhouse rebellion in the 1840s supposedly began because inmates were furious about being served sweat pudding without enough raisins. It sounds ridiculous, storming over dried fruit, but hunger makes small injustices sharp, and the pudding became the flashpoint for pent-up resentment. Of course, rebellion was dangerous. Punishments ranged from solitary confinement to reduced rations, sometimes even being hauled before magistrates. Yet, in those moments, you felt alive. For once, you weren't merely surviving, you were insisting, however clumsily, on your dignity. Historians still argue whether escapes and rebellions were acts of desperation or sparks of agency. Were inmates reclaiming control over their lives or simply flailing against a system too vast to break? The truth probably lies somewhere between. For you, in the thick of it, the line blurs. Rebellion is both survival and statement. Picture it. The thrill of sneaking a glance at the gate, timing the guard's footsteps, heart pounding louder than the church bell. Or the hush in the dormitory when someone dares to mutter, "We should refuse the stew tomorrow." It's risky, reckless, and yet strangely comforting. Proof that the human spirit doesn't lie quietly forever. Even humor finds its way in. You catch yourself joking with a fellow inmate, "If I make it out, I'll open a bakery and serve nothing but raisin pudding, extra raisins." The two of you laugh, quickly muffling it before the matron notices. It's gallows humor, but it makes the days bearable. And if escape doesn't come, rebellion still reshapes you. The act of imagining freedom, of dreaming beyond the walls, plants a seed that can't be ground down by oakum or drowned in gruel. Each whispered plan, each tiny act of defiance reminds you that you're not entirely broken. The workhouse was designed to crush individuality, But escapes and rebellions prove a stubborn truth. People will always look for cracks in the wall, literal or metaphorical. Whether it's a missing raisin or the dream of running to the river docks, resistance thrives even here. So you lie awake, heart steady now, tracing the ceiling beams above. Maybe you'll never make it beyond these walls. Or maybe, just maybe, you'll be the next whispered story, the one others tell in hushed awe. Remember that inmate who slipped away under the moonlight? Outside the heavy gates, you breathe in damp air that feels strangely freer, though it smells of rotting cabbage leaves and coal smoke. For all the harshness inside, many in Victorian London chose the outside world over the workhouse, even when it meant rags, hunger, and cold stone streets. You picture yourself stepping out, clutching a threadbare shawl, wondering which is truly worse, the ordered misery of the workhouse or the chaotic despair beyond it. You notice rag pickers bent double along the alleys, poking with sticks through heaps of refuse. They collect bones, nails, string, anything that might be sold to a dealer. It seems degrading, but also strangely independent. At least you can keep what you find. Mainstream accounts confirm that whole families survive this way, children scuttling like sparrows to snatch bits of cloth. And here comes your first joke of the night. You could almost imagine a Victorian Antiques Roadshow, except instead of fine silver, the contestant proudly presents half a shoelace and 3 buttons, hoping for a fortune. If you're desperate, you might join the match girls, dipping wooden sticks into phosphorus to create matches. It pays pennies, but the real cost is phossy jaw, the gruesome necrosis caused by breathing fumes all day. Historians still argue whether factory owners truly didn't know the danger or simply ignored it. Either way, you don't fancy your teeth glowing green before falling out. Another option is prostitution. London's sex trade was notorious, and reformers wrung their hands over fallen women. Police reports list thousands, though estimates vary wildly. A quirky fact: some brothels kept pet monkeys, partly for amusement, partly because customers apparently liked the exotic flair. Victorian taste was strange indeed. The nights outside are brutal. You might pay a penny for a 4-penny coffin bed, where you literally sit slumped over a rope until morning. You probably won't survive many of those, but at least it beats freezing outright. Newspapers joked about these establishments, but inspectors admitted they served a purpose, giving the homeless somewhere to sag. You wrap your arms tighter, feeling your ribs like fence posts. Remember how we laughed earlier about gruel? Out here, you dream of that watery bowl, because here there is nothing at all. Charity sometimes intervenes. Missions hand out soup or bread. Churches offer brief shelter if you sit through a sermon. The Salvation Army marches by, drums beating, promising moral reform alongside a hot drink. It's noisy, earnest, and perhaps your only comfort in a week. Yet for all these scraps of aid, most Londoners walking past you look away, muttering about idleness. The paradox is striking. People feared the workhouse, but many still believed you deserved it if you ended up here. You try a night in Spitalfields, sharing a corner with weavers turned destitute. Their whispers tell of riots in the past, of livelihoods crushed by machines. You think of the endless oakum picking inside the walls and realize exploitation is everywhere. Only the backdrop changes. Here, it's the streets. There, it's the workhouse. The debate continues among historians whether choosing destitution outside showed resilience or desperation. Maybe it's both. 3 jokes rule still. First, imagine explaining to a modern audience that you rent a bed for a penny, but it's really just half a rope. Second, picture yourself sneezing into a rag, then realizing the rag is someone's livelihood. And third, the odd Victorian advice column that suggested eating raw onions to stay warm. Your breath alone would clear the streets, leaving you in blissful solitude. Step by step, you understand the cruel choice Victorians faced, structured suffering inside or chaotic peril outside. Neither promises dignity, but both reveal the grinding gears of a city that thrives while its poor stumble. Your journey edges closer to its conclusion, but the shadow of the workhouse still stretches across every alley and rope bed. You wake with stiff joints and a mouth that tastes of dust, realizing you've reached the final stretch of your journey. Around you, London shifts with the slow heartbeat of dawn. Carriages creaking, vendors shouting, chimney sweeps already blackened before breakfast. It is the same city that imprisoned you in stone walls, then spat you out into the gutter, and yet, from this vantage, you can see the pattern more clearly. The workhouse was not just a building, it was a philosophy, one that declared poverty a crime and demanded penance for the misfortune of being born poor. Inside, you endured oakum, stale bread, and sermons that drilled shame into your skull. Outside, you staggered through rope beds, phosphorus fumes, and the endless scramble for a crust. Both sides of the gate carried suffering, but the workhouse dressed it in the language of discipline and moral reform. Mainstream records tell us Parliament debated endlessly whether such institutions truly helped. Reports brimmed with statistics, meals served, beds occupied, paupers registered, but those numbers did little to capture the human cost. Here's your quirky tidbit to savor before the end. Some Victorians wrote tourist-style guidebooks about London's poverty, encouraging curious middle-class readers to visit slums for the thrill of it. Poverty as a spectacle, almost like a grim amusement park. You can almost imagine the ticket booth. Step right up, see the starving children and coughing grandmothers. It's grotesque, yet it shows how normalized suffering had become. And still, historians argue whether the workhouse crushed more lives than it saved. Did it offer food and shelter, however meager, to those with nowhere else to go? Or did it grind dignity so thoroughly into dust that even the most desperate preferred freezing on a rope? The debate lingers, unresolved, echoing like footsteps in a stone corridor long after the buildings themselves were demolished. For you, the answer is lived, not studied. You felt the clatter of boots on flagged floors, smelled the cabbage boiled beyond recognition, heard the muttered prayers of men who no longer believed. You walked out into alleys filled with bone pickers and match girls, where every cough was a drumbeat of mortality. You were never truly free, whether inside or out, only shuffled from one form of hardship to another. And now it is time to soften the edges, to let the imagery fade and your breathing slow. Picture yourself stepping away from the smoke-choked city. The clang of workhouse bells grows faint, like a memory slipping underwater. The cobblestones beneath your feet warm into sand, and the London fog unravels into a gentle, sea-scented mist. You lie down, not on a rope bed, not on a straw pallet, but on a wide stretch of quiet shore, the horizon glowing with the softest pink. Your body, once taut with hunger, loosens as though weight is draining out of you. You no longer carry oakum fibers in your fingertips, nor the rasp of sermons in your ears. Instead, you hear the hush of waves, the faint whisper of gulls, the rhythm of your own calm breath. The workhouse doors are far behind, bolted shut forever, and the streets with their refuse and noise are drifting into shadow. Here, there is no ledger, no overseer, no deserving or undeserving poor, only rest, only the promise that you are enough without proving it through labor or suffering. The questions that haunted you, the debates, the punishments, the choices no one should ever face, dissolve into the tide. What remains is stillness, the kind that spreads through your chest like warmth. Let your eyelids grow heavy. Let the story sink into the sand with you, a relic of another time. And as you listen to the faint hum around you, whether it's the fan in your room, the night traffic outside, or simply the pulse of silence, allow it to carry you gently toward sleep. Good night, traveler. You've walked the streets of Victorian London, survived its workhouse walls, and now you are free. Truly free. If you're still awake, don't worry. We'll be right here with you tonight, and together we'll drift into our second story. Your foot crossing the threshold of the workhouse gate. The door slams shut behind you with a clang that feels final, like the iron bite of a lock you'll never forget. You think you're free, but step by step, London proves that escape isn't as simple as crossing one line. The city itself, with its fog and its soot and its endless press of humanity, feels like a workhouse without walls. You stand there for a moment, breathing in the chill. The air tastes of coal smoke, sour beer, and horse dung, a cocktail that no candle could disguise. You squint through the smog, and everything blurs. Chimneys spit black breath into the sky, and carriages rattle over cobblestones slick with refuse. There's a tangle of voices, hawkers yelling about hot eels, children shrieking with laughter, someone swearing at a stubborn donkey. The city hums like a restless beehive. But there's something about the way people glance at you. Maybe it's the worn boots, the coat frayed at the cuffs, the way your stomach caves under your ribs. The workhouse clings to you like a second skin. Historians still argue whether the stigma was worse than the hunger itself, but you feel it in every sideways look. In Victorian London, poverty wasn't just bad luck. It was a moral failing, a kind of public sin. You wander forward, your hands shoved deep into pockets that hold little more than lint. The irony doesn't escape you. Just as in the workhouse, your choices are controlled. Outside, it's the city's machinery pressing you down rather than a master's ledger. You probably won't survive this, but hey, at least you don't have to listen to the endless scrape of workhouse spoons and tin bowls anymore. As you move, you notice details that would have made Charles Dickens rub his hands in glee. A woman with 3 skirts patched into one sways under a bundle of firewood. An old soldier with a wooden leg limps along, muttering to himself, begging with a tin cup. A group of ragged children, their feet blue with cold, dart between carts, selling matches for a halfpenny. Their voices have the same edge you remember from the workhouse nursery. Half child, half animal, hungered to the bone. Here's a mainstream fact. By the mid-19th century, nearly 30% of Londoners were living below the poverty line. That's not a fringe corner. That's a whole swath of the city moving in shadows. And yet, the middle classes clung to the idea that the poor simply needed to work harder, be more moral, or pray more earnestly. You chuckle at the absurdity. If prayer filled bellies, the workhouse would have been a banquet hall. You push through a market, your senses assaulted by contradictions. Fat geese hang plucked and ready for roasting, their pale skin glistening. Wheels of cheese tower behind a stall, and right in front of all this abundance, barefoot children lick their lips, staring like cats locked out of a dairy. One boy sticks out his tongue at you, as if mocking you for joining their ranks. You grin back. You've been demoted into his world now, and he knows it. A quirky tidbit? Some vendors in this era sprinkled sawdust on the ground to soak up spilt beer and rotten fish juice. But here's the kicker. Poor children sometimes scooped up that sawdust to chew, just to quiet the gnawing in their stomachs. Imagine crunching damp, salty wood shavings just so your belly wouldn't claw itself inside out. Suddenly, the workhouse gruel doesn't sound so bad, does it? London's geography presses in on you. The endless alleys twist like intestines, coughing you out into broader roads only to suck you back in again. The city grows by swallowing its poor, building up slums so dense they rival the dormitories you just escaped. Everywhere, the brick walls sweat moisture, the gutters overflow with slop, and the lamps flicker like weak stars in a sky forever obscured by soot. Your thoughts wander, softer now, as you realize that even freedom outside comes with rules written in smoke. No ticket of leave, no shining new start. You carry the brand of pauper whether you like it or not. You feel it most sharply when you pass by shop windows. Glittering dresses, polished shoes, gilt-edged books. You're not just looking through glass, you're looking through class. And you're firmly on the wrong side. One joke springs up in your mind, unbidden. At least out here, when you cough, you don't have to do it in rhythm with 30 other miserable souls in a ward. Variety is the spice of life, right? The thought makes you smile, then cough for real, because the soot-laden air scratches your throat. Night begins creeping in, the gas lamps hissing to life. The shadows grow teeth, and the noise shifts. The hawkers quiet, replaced by footsteps of men heading to taverns, the laughter of women beckoning in doorways, the metallic jangle of a constable's truncheon at his belt. You tug your coat tighter. You thought leaving the workhouse meant freedom. But now, it feels like stepping into a larger cage, one with invisible bars. And yet, there's an odd thrill in it. For the first time in months, maybe years, there's no master watching over your spoonfuls, no bell dictating your every move. The city might be a beast, but at least it doesn't tell you when to sleep. That thought is enough to push you forward into the fog. Heart thumping, feet shuffling into the unknown. You step deeper into the labyrinth of London, the mist curling around your ankles like a living thing. The further you move from the market's glow, the darker the streets become, until the gas lamps feel like tiny, fragile candles trying to hold back an ocean of night. Your ears catch everything. The squeal of carriage wheels, the flap of laundry lines in narrow alleys, the quick patter of footsteps behind you that vanish when you turn your head. You pass a gin palace first. Its windows glow amber, and the laughter inside spills out, muffled and rough, punctuated by bursts of shouting. A poster on the wall outside declares, "Drunk for a penny, dead drunk for twopence." You grin at the slogan's honesty. Imagine being able to buy oblivion for the same price as a loaf of stale bread. Historians still argue whether the gin craze was more destructive than poverty itself, but here in the shadows, you see the two tangled together like lovers. Your stomach growls, so you wander toward a row of street food vendors. They hawk bowls of hot eels, meat pies, whose filling you're not entirely convinced is meat, and roasted chestnuts popping in their shells. The smell makes your mouth water, but your pockets, as you know too well, are a hollow joke. You hover close anyway, inhaling as if scent alone could feed you. Here's a mainstream fact to chew on, literally. Victorian Londoners consumed staggering amounts of cheap fried eels because the Thames was once teeming with them. It was the poor man's protein, greasy and plentiful, before pollution drove them nearly to extinction. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some vendors advertise their pies with mystery fillings, often joked about as 4 and 20 blackbirds, not quite nursery rhyme whimsy, unless you fancy crow or cat. As you shuffle past, you hear a child's voice rise above the rest. "Penny for a song!" A boy no older than 7 stands on a crate, his cap too big for his head, belting out a tune in a voice half sweet, half rasp. People toss him coins, not out of kindness, but because his song fills the silence between their sips of gin. You can't decide which feels sadder, the workhouse nursery or this little performer with lungs for rent. You keep moving, weaving between figures. A group of women loiter under a gaslight, their painted smiles stretched thin, their laughter sharp enough to cut. One crooks her finger at you teasing, but you shake your head quickly. You're too poor even for trouble tonight. They laugh at your retreat, voices echoing like bells in the fog. You mutter under your breath, "Better mocked than robbed," and carry on. There's your second joke for the night, whispered just for yourself. The cobblestones here are slick, the gutters alive with waste. You nearly slip when you step on something soft. It squishes underfoot. You glance down to see a dead rat, bloated and pale. Funny thing, Victorians sometimes caught rats alive, using them for dog-fighting entertainment in grimy taverns. Imagine men cheering as terriers tore through a cage of squealing rodents. A strange sport, but then again, boredom and misery breed curious amusements. Your feet lead you toward the docks. The air thickens with the smell of tar, fish, and damp rope. Ships loom in the distance like sleeping beasts, their masts swaying against the cloudy night sky. Dock workers shout as they unload crates, while boys your age and younger scamper like mice, hauling sacks twice their size. You pause, wondering if you could slip in unnoticed, join the crew of a ship, and leave London entirely. Historians still debate how many workhouse runaways tried exactly that. Some became sailors, some vanished. Some ended up right back where you started, dragged by constables to the nearest parish. For now, you stay on land. You lean against a post, watching the river roll by, black and oily under the weak moonlight. The Thames doesn't sparkle, it stinks. And yet, there's something hypnotic about its slow, relentless pull, as if it's whispering, "Come closer, drift away, escape." You almost laugh. Your third joke, because of course the river wants you. Everyone dumps their rubbish into it. Why wouldn't it collect people too? The night deepens. The city never sleeps, but it changes costume. The respectable folk vanish behind bolted doors, leaving behind those who scavenge, hustle, or prey. You pass a group of resurrection men, or at least you think you do. Their cart is covered, suspiciously lumpy. and their eyes flick too quickly toward you before looking away. You remember the whispers, body snatchers selling corpses to medical schools. Some even dug up fresh graves, and suddenly the workhouse cots feel almost luxurious compared to a slab in one of those carts. You shiver, pulling your coat tighter. It's not just the cold. It's the awareness that out here you don't even have the fragile protection of the workhouse walls. Hunger and fear are your only companions, and both gnaw at you. Yet in a strange way, this city feels more alive, more unpredictable, more yours. For once, no matron calls your name, no master points a finger at the next task. You're lost, but free in the fog. Your feet ache, your belly protests, and your eyelids droop, but still you walk. Because to stop in this city is to be noticed, and to be noticed when you're poor and alone is rarely a blessing. So you move on, a shadow among shadows, the night stretching ahead of you like a question with no clear answer. You drift away from the river, your steps pulling you into streets where the fog grows thicker, swallowing lamp glow and muting every sound. Here, the city feels like it's holding its breath, waiting for you to slip. The cobblestones are uneven, the alleys so narrow that when you press your arms wide, you can almost touch both sides. Somewhere above, laundry lines sag with damp sheets that flap like pale ghosts. You're looking for a place to rest, even just to curl up until morning. But every doorway already has a shape huddled there, a figure asleep under rags, a mother with a baby hidden under her shawl, a drunk sprawled on the steps. There's no vacancy sign for poverty. The streets are full. You sigh, your breath clouding in the cold, and wonder if maybe you'd be safer back in the workhouse after all. The smell changes as you turn a corner. Sharp vinegar, sour beer, and something earthy. You've stumbled onto a tannery, where animal hides are stretched out like grotesque sails. Even at night, the stench lingers. Workers often lived right beside their trade, soaked in the very smell they earned pennies from. Mainstream fact. Victorian Londoners joked you could track a tanner in a crowd without ever seeing his face. And here's the quirky part. Some claim that soaking hides in dog dung made them softer. Imagine scraping muck from the street just to cure leather. Historians still argue whether dung or human urine was the more common tool in tanning. But either way, you wrinkle your nose. You press on, feet dragging. Your eyes flick to a shadow moving in the alley ahead. Two boys are crouched low, whispering over something that glints. As you step closer, you realize they're prying coins from a gentleman's dropped pocketbook. They notice you, eyes sharp. One presses a finger to his lips. The other clutches a tiny blade, not even long enough to butter bread, but sharp enough to make a point. You raise your hands, back away slow. Lesson learned. Never interrupt a pickpocket's winnings. Your own stomach interrupts next, louder than your courage. And that's when the smell of roasted chestnuts finds you again, drifting from a vendor with a tiny coal stove. You don't have a penny, but the thought of warmth makes you linger. The vendor eyes you, grunts, and flicks a single burned nut toward you. Charity? Pity? Or maybe just a way to keep you moving along. You snatch it, the shell still hot enough to sting, and crack it with your teeth. It tastes bitter, but at least it's something. You murmur thanks to the night air, half expecting no one to hear. You wander farther until music reaches your ears. Faint fiddle notes, a drum keeping time. You follow the sound to a firelit circle tucked under an archway where Irish laborers are gathered. They stomp, clap, and sing with voices that rise above the city's weight. One woman pulls another into a spinning dance, her skirts flaring like a banner. You stay at the edges, invisible, letting the rhythm pulse through you. For a moment, you're not poor, not hungry, just caught in the current of sound. Of course, your host brain can't resist a joke. You join in, but given your empty belly, you'd collapse faster than the fiddle string about to snap. And when it does snap, whipping across the player's hand, the crowd bursts out laughing as though hunger and hardship have no grip here tonight. Later, when the crowd thins, you walk on. The laughter fades, replaced by the scrape of a rat's claws and the drip-drip of water from somewhere overhead. You glance up at a bridge where shadows cluster like crows. A constable steps into view, his lantern swinging. He calls out, demanding names, demanding reason. You freeze. Running would mark you as guilty. Standing still makes you pray. Luckily, another figure darts past, and the constable gives chase, boots pounding. You exhale, your heart thumping, grateful for someone else's bad timing. Your feet finally betray you. You find yourself slumping into a narrow recess where two brick walls meet. The ground is damp, but exhaustion is heavier than disgust. You pull your coat tight and curl up, astray among strays. You listen to the city's lullaby, distant carriage wheels, a snatch of laughter, a cough muffled in the night. And as you drift, your last thought is half dream, half wish. Maybe when morning comes, the fog will lift, the hunger will vanish, and you'll wake somewhere brighter. Historians might still argue what gave London its darkest edge, disease, poverty, crime, or despair, but as your eyelids sink shut, you know the truth is simpler. Sometimes it's all of them, wrapped in the same night air you're breathing now. Morning finds you not with sunshine, but with drizzle, that slow, patient mist that soaks through wool and skin without you realizing. You blink awake, bones stiff, back pressed against the rough wall where you collapsed. A rat scurries near your foot, bold as any house cat. You mutter something half asleep, but the rat doesn't care. In London, you're both just tenants of the same damp city. The streets begin to stir with carts creaking, horses snorting, hawkers calling out their wares. You shuffle to your feet, brushing grime from your coat, though grime is practically stitched into the fabric now. Hunger claws at you immediately, like a demanding child tugging at your sleeve. You know it will gnaw at you all day unless you find something. You stumble into a street where bakers pull loaves from ovens, steam billowing like a miracle. The smell alone is enough to make you dizzy. But without a farthing, you're just a beggar at the window. Some bakers used to leave burnt crusts for the poor, tossed out as waste. Mainstream fact. Bakers even had special doors at the back of their shops called charity hatches, where scraps were handed to those desperate enough to ask. Tonight, no hatch opens. You lean against the wall, pretending you don't care, though your stomach disagrees loudly. A quirky tidbit drifts into your thoughts. Victorian doctors swore that chewing charcoal helped with hunger pangs. You glance down at the blackened wood scraps near the baker's oven and wonder, is this dinner, or am I about to join some historical science experiment? You decide against it. Your teeth deserve better. You follow the street toward Smithfield, where the market roars like a living beast. Cattle bellow, pigs squeal, men shout prices. The ground is slick with mud, manure, and blood all churned together. Your boots slip, but you manage to stay upright. Butchers heft cleavers like extensions of their arms, carving through meat while haggling mid-sentence. It's chaotic, violent, and mesmerizing. Historians still argue whether Smithfield was the lifeblood of the city or its moral disgrace. A spectacle of cruelty masquerading as commerce. You keep your head down, weaving between men driving sheep with sticks, the animals' eyes wide and frantic. For one awful moment, you lock eyes with a calf tied to a post. You look away quickly. Better not to think too much about the similarities between livestock and yourself. Both trapped, both waiting to be consumed by the city. On the edge of the market, you find scavengers, children no taller than the carcasses, scraping bits of fat or marrow from discarded bones. You kneel beside one, a girl with dirt-smeared cheeks. She eyes you, then wordlessly passes you a sliver of gristle. No words, no charity, just the unspoken rule of survival. Share the scraps, because tomorrow the roles could reverse. You chew it, the taste faintly rancid, but real enough to steady you. Further down, a commotion rises. A man stands atop a crate, shouting about temperance, his voice competing with the braying of donkeys. "Drink is the devil's poison," he bellows, waving a pamphlet. Around him, dock workers laugh, swigging cheap gin from bottles wrapped in rags. The preacher doesn't stop, though. You almost admire the stubbornness. Of course, gin has its own shadow in Victorian London. They called it Mother's Ruin, a drink that knocked the poor sideways. Quirky fact. Some gin shops sold the stuff by the penny, poured not in cups, but in thimbles. You can picture yourself sipping from a sewing tool, pretending it's class. Not that you can afford even that. You wander away from the noise, down a quieter alley where scraps of posters peel from the walls. One shows a circus, bright colors, acrobats, elephants marching in line. Another promises a freak show, with the bearded lady and the living skeleton. You shiver. Sometimes poverty itself turned people into exhibitions. Historians still argue whether freak shows gave people dignity by earning them money or stripped them of humanity by putting their suffering on stage. Either way, you decide you're grateful no one's charging admission to watch you yet. A sudden shout pulls your attention. Two boys dash past, one clutching a loaf of bread. Behind them, a baker charges, apron flapping like sails. He roars curses you wouldn't dare repeat. The boys vanish into an alley too tight for a grown man. The baker gives up, panting. He spits in the street, mutters, and stomps back. You watch it all, heart thumping. For a moment, you almost chased after them, hoping they'd drop a crumb. But your pride, or maybe just your weariness, kept your feet planted. By late afternoon, the drizzle lifts, and the city looks almost golden in the weak light. The illusion doesn't fool you. You know what waits when night falls again. But for now, you linger near a ragged man selling ballads, cheap printed sheets with songs and scandal stories. He croons a tune about a sailor lost at sea, his voice surprisingly sweet. You lean against a wall, humming along. It's not food, it's not shelter, but it's something that makes the hunger feel smaller, even if just for a few minutes. And when the song ends, the man winks at you. "Sing for your supper," he jokes, though your supper is long gone. Still, the idea tickles you. Standing here, belting out a tune in a voice half-cracked, coins tossed at your feet. You laugh quietly to yourself. knowing your luck, you'd earn rotten fruit instead. You shuffle onward, the sun dipping low, fog creeping back in. You survived another day, barely. Tomorrow will demand the same bargain, endure hunger, dodge trouble, and hope that luck, thin as it is, doesn't run out. The city grows colder as twilight bleeds into night. You know well enough what happens if you linger outdoors. Cold stiffens your joints, and fog seeps into your lungs until your breath rattles like a broken bellows. So, you drift toward the place where many of London's forgotten end their days, the common lodging house. You find one down a narrow alley, its crooked sign swinging in the wind. The doorway yawns dark, like the throat of some beast ready to swallow you. A woman in a shawl leans against the wall outside, her eyes sharp as glass. She looks you over the way butchers eye a side of beef, then nods once, jerking her head toward the entrance. It's invitation enough. Inside, the air is hot, damp, and thick with humanity. A dozen smells crowd the nostrils at once: sweat, gin, mildew, stale tobacco. Voices overlap, angry mutters, hollow laughter, low bargaining over halfpennies. You slide your way toward the keeper's desk, where a heavy man in a stained vest sits with his ledger. He doesn't look at you so much as through you, muttering the prices like a chant he's said 1,000 times. A penny for the rope bed, 2 pence for a shared mattress, 4 pence if you fancy a coffin bed. You blink. Coffin bed? He gestures without lifting his head, pointing toward a dark corner. You see them lined against the wall. Long wooden boxes, narrow as a grave, with sliding lids that pull shut. Each one holds a sleeper already, their faces slack in exhausted oblivion. The lid offers privacy, yes, but also feels disturbingly final. You can almost hear the lid sliding shut above your head, sealing you in forever. But rope bed it is. You've not the coins for anything else. You shuffle down a corridor and find them strung in rows, coarse ropes pulled tight across wooden frames. They sag beneath the weight of men and women curled like kittens, coats pulled over their heads. The ropes cut into flesh if you shift wrong, but they're cheap. And in London, cheap means survival. Historical note. Rope beds weren't just real. They were sometimes called 2-penny hangovers. Guests would literally pay a penny to lean across a rope strung from wall to wall, dozing half upright like clothes left to dry. When morning came, the keeper cut the rope loose, dropping everyone to the floor. A grim sort of alarm clock. You settle in, the rope biting your ribs, but you're too tired to care. Around you, snores rise like the sea. A woman mutters feverishly in her sleep, her words broken, meaningless. Somewhere, a baby wails, quickly hushed by a mother's whisper. The sounds blend into a kind of nocturne, the city's lullaby for its poorest children. But sleep does not come easily. The itch starts almost immediately. Fleas, bedbugs, lice, every inch of this place crawls. You scratch, first casually, then desperately, until your skin burns. You remind yourself it's still better than the stones outside, though the difference feels smaller by the hour. Quirky historical aside, inspectors once visited lodging houses, writing horrified reports of human effluvia thick enough to cut with a knife. One reformer claimed you could smell the stench from the next street over. Reading those accounts now, you can't help but smirk bitterly. At least the writers went home to clean beds after scribbling their shock. At some point, you drift into half-sleep. Dreams come fast and fevered. You're back in the workhouse, but the rope beneath you becomes the gallows, and the keeper's pen scratching in his ledger turns into the priest's last prayer. You wake gasping, sweat chilling on your skin. You roll onto your side, and for a moment you just watch the others. One man clutches a sack against his chest as if it holds treasure. Another scratches at his arm until it bleeds, too tired to stop. A woman murmurs a lullaby to herself, no child in sight. Each life a story, compressed into a penny's worth of space. Toward dawn, the keeper's heavy boots stomp through the corridor. He shouts at those still dozing, reminding them the bed is bought only for the night. Outside, the city begins its restless stir again, and soon the house empties, its inhabitants spilling back into the streets like ants shaken from a nest. You step into the pale morning light, stiff, filthy, itching, but alive. A day in London always begins the same, with the thin, stubborn miracle of survival. The morning is raw, but the rope bed ache clings to your bones like damp clothes. Your stomach growls for bread you cannot afford. So you drift with the others toward the corner where bottles glint behind cracked glass. Gin. Mother's ruin, they call it, and you understand why. It is cheap, it is everywhere, and it promises, however briefly, to quiet the gnawing hollowness inside you. The gin shop is hardly a shop at all. A room no bigger than a stable, walls stained brown with years of spilled drink, its wooden counter sticky beneath your hands. Behind it, a woman pours measure after measure, never meeting anyone's eye, just filling, clinking, sliding mugs like she's part of a machine. She's thin, tired, but her voice cuts through the din. Threepence a quartern. The glass lands in your hand, its contents clear as water. You sniff, but the smell sears your nose, sharp, chemical, almost medicinal. Historians still argue whether what passed as gin here was even drinkable. Records suggest many vendors diluted it with turpentine or sulfuric acid to stretch profits. Still, you drink. It burns going down, a fire that tears through your throat and sits hot in your chest. The world softens at the edges almost instantly. The ache in your belly dulls. The rope bed bruise fades to background noise, and the fog of despair lifts, if only an inch. A joke bubbles to your lips unbidden. Who needs medicine when poison works faster? Around you, others drink with desperate focus. A man gulps his measure, slams the glass down, and bellows a laugh too big for the room. Another weeps openly, holding his cup as though it were a friend. A girl no older than 16 stares blankly into hers, lips moving in silent prayer before she swallows. Quirky fact. London's obsession with gin was so notorious in the 18th and 19th centuries that cartoons called it liquid madness. One drawing showed a mother dropping her baby into the gin vat by accident, part satire, part horrifyingly plausible. Reformers shouted about morality, but cheap gin kept its throne, because misery always finds its cheapest escape. You step back outside, warmth lingering, dizziness setting in. The city looks different, as if softened by gauze. Smoke curls prettily in the sky, not chokingly. The cobbles gleam under your boots, not treacherous, but inviting. Hunger nags less, though your stomach knows it's been tricked. Someone offers you another swig from a shared bottle. You hesitate, then take it, lips brushing the same rim as a dozen others before you. Germs? Disease? In London, those worries feel absurd. The city itself is a contagion, might as well toast to it. The light fades fast when you're floating. Hours pass without shape. You sway between alleys, laugh at nothing, hum tunes you don't remember knowing. The gin makes the city tolerable, but it also makes the line between survival and collapse dangerously thin. You pass one man sprawled against a wall, his breath shallow, skin pale. No one stops. In this place, the city itself is triage, mainstream historical detail. Parliament eventually tried to curb the gin craze with licensing laws and taxes. Reformers declared victory when consumption dropped, but most poor souls simply shifted to cheaper, rougher spirits, or home-brewed rot-gut passed hand to hand. One reformer even admitted, "We did not save the people, we merely changed their poison." As dusk falls, the gin fog in your head deepens into a kind of underwater haze. You stagger back toward the lodging houses, but your coin's gone. So you lean against a wall, pulling your coat close, giggling at shadows that dance larger than life. A child points at you from across the street, tugging at her mother's hand, whispering. But the mother pulls her away quickly, not daring to let pity linger. Your laughter dies as fast as it came. The gin leaves you empty, throat dry, stomach churning. You've traded hunger for poison, hope for haze. And yet tomorrow you'll likely do the same again. Because in Victorian London, the cruelest truth is simple. Gin doesn't fix your life, but it makes you forget you're living it. Night presses close, and in the narrow lane ahead, you notice them. Small figures huddled against the wall, knees pulled up to their chests. At first, you think they are bundles of rags tossed aside, but then one shifts and coughs. Children, dozens of them, lined like discarded dolls, their eyes too large for their thin faces. You slow your steps, the sound of your boots echoing unnaturally loud. They do not chatter, do not giggle, do not chase rats or toss stones like children should. They sit in silence, watching the world pass, their expressions ancient in a way no child's face should ever be. Historians still argue whether London truly had tens of thousands of street children at any given time, or whether the numbers were inflated by reformers seeking donations. But whether you call it 10,000 or 100,000, the truth lies here in the cold. Too many. One boy catches your eye. His bare feet are blue with chill, his shirt torn to ribbons. He lifts a finger to his lips, shh, as though silence is survival itself. And perhaps it is. Policemen pass by without a glance. Ladies sweep past with skirts raised high, faces turned away. A horse-drawn carriage rattles along, splashing gutter water, but not one child flinches. They are stone, waiting. A quirky tidbit drifts into your thoughts. There were reports of rat boys in London, children who scuttled through drains and sewers, emerging only at night to steal crusts. Some dismissed it as urban legend, yet every reformer's diary has at least one story of a filthy, blinking child clambering up from below. Tonight, watching the motionless rows, you half believe it. You sit down near them, the cobbles damp beneath you, the silence wraps around your ears, louder than noise. Occasionally, a hand reaches out when a passerby looks generous. Mostly, the hands stay curled in the rags, holding in warmth, holding in hunger. You whisper, "Why don't you play?" But no one answers. The boy beside you coughs again, a dry sound, then pulls his knees tighter. Mainstream fact. Philanthropic schools did exist. Ragged schools, they were called, offering scraps of education to the poorest children. Charles Dickens even praised them. But for every child who made it into a classroom, dozens remained here, lining the walls. Many couldn't risk leaving their begging posts. Education didn't feed you tonight. You watch as a woman appears at the far end of the lane, skirts dragging, a basket at her side. She pauses before the rows. One by one, she drops crusts of bread, not even glancing at faces. The children take them silently, with a reverence that is more ritual than meal. You think of communion, the way each hand accepts, each mouth chews solemnly. The woman disappears again without a word. The boy beside you breaks his bread in half and presses the smaller piece into your palm. His hand is icy, his eyes unblinking. You don't know whether to laugh or weep. You murmur, you keep it, but he shakes his head once. Somewhere a bell tolls midnight. The children stir only slightly, shifting, retucking their rags, settling for sleep right there on the stones. No blankets, no beds, only the shallow heat of bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder. They lean against the wall as though gravity itself is the nurse that rocks them. A whisper rises from one of the smaller girls, a lullaby, out of tune, half forgotten. A song about a lamb, perhaps. You catch only fragments. The others don't join in, but the sound hangs in the air like smoke. And you think, this is not silence after all. This is a symphony of absence. The absence of toys, of warmth, of laughter. The absence of someone to tuck them in. Victorian London is loud with carts and shouting vendors, but here the loudest sound is what's missing. You close your eyes just for a moment, sitting among them. The stones press cold through your coat. When you open them again, you realize the children have not moved. Still rows of ragged bodies, still eyes staring, still silence humming. And it hits you. In this city, to be a child is not to grow. It is to endure. The air inside the dormitory is heavy, thicker than the fog outside. You push open the door and step into a long hall lined with wooden cots, each one sagging under the weight of a weary body. The smell strikes first, a blend of damp straw, unwashed feet, and the sharp tang of sickness. Then comes the sound, the chorus of coughs, shallow and rattling, rising and falling like waves on a restless sea. You tread carefully between the rows. Lanterns flicker, throwing thin shadows over faces that look carved from wax. Children, elders, mothers with babes, all pressed together under one roof. A single thin blanket covers two, sometimes three people. A rat scurries along the wall, bold enough to be part of the furniture. No one notices, no one cares. Mainstream fact. Workhouse dormitories often cram dozens, sometimes hundreds, into one space. Ventilation was poor, sanitation worse. Outbreaks of measles, typhus, or influenza could sweep through like a match through paper. Workhouses were little better than plague pits, one critic wrote. And yet, people came because outside the streets killed quicker. You pass a cot where a girl no older than 8 lies curled beside her mother. Her lips are cracked. Her chest rattles with every breath. She clutches a rag doll, its button eyes loose, stuffing spilling out. The doll has been patched so many times that no original cloth remains. It looks more scar tissue than toy. You wonder if she even remembers it was once whole. There's a fringe detail you can't shake. Some Victorians believed that the smell of rotting straw could purge impurities from the body. Doctors debated whether the foul air itself spread disease or, bizarrely, somehow healed it. Historians still argue whether the medical profession truly thought bad odors carried sickness, or if it was just an excuse for poor hygiene. Tonight, your nose wrinkles as you inhale. and you'd stake a bet that the stench does far more harm than good. You lean closer to one of the older men, his beard matted, his breath shallow. His eyes snap open suddenly, startling you. "Don't take me yet," he whispers to no one. Then he closes his eyes again, as if bargaining with an invisible figure who stalks the rows with an unseen ledger. Another cough erupts, deeper, wetter. This one from the far corner. The sound builds as if contagious, spreading from bed to bed until the whole dorm seems to shake with hacking, rasping lungs. The overseer at the door sighs, tugs his coat tighter, and steps out again. He won't spend the night breathing this air. Why risk it? You edge toward the windows, tall and grimy, their panes rattling faintly in the wind. They've been nailed shut. Too many tried to escape through them, you're told. Better to keep them sealed, even if the room stinks of decay. You rub a circle clear with your sleeve, peering out into the black street. It looks no kinder than the dormitory. For a moment, you imagine the building breathing, exhaling in coughs, inhaling in shivers. The dormitory is alive, and you are swallowed by it. Just another sleeper, just another pair of lungs filling with damp air. Someone mutters in their sleep, words lost beneath the coughs. Another thrashes, then falls still. The straw rustles like dry leaves, and through it all, the lantern flickers on, stubborn, throwing pale light on pale faces. You sit on the edge of an empty cot, if such a thing exists here. The wood creaks. You wonder how many nights this building has seen like this. A century? More? How many names were whispered into the dark, never written down, never remembered? The coughs continue, a lullaby of sickness. Oddly enough, you feel your own chest tighten, as if the air is pressing in. You cough once, quietly, testing yourself. And the sound blends seamlessly into the chorus, just one more note in the dormitory's endless song. You step back into the courtyard, ears still full of the dormitory's coughing chorus. The cold air tastes clean compared to the thick dorm stench, and you gulp it down. That's when you notice the children huddled in a corner near the pump, whispering in a knot of secrecy. Their clothes hang loose, patched until the patches have patches. Yet their eyes gleam with something you haven't seen much in this place. Mischief. Victorian workhouse kids weren't supposed to rebel. They were supposed to march in lines, eat in silence, and labor until their knuckles split. But children are born with rebellion stitched into their bones, and even here it surfaced. You hear the faint rattle of marbles on stone, smoothed pebbles stolen from the yard. The smallest boy cups them in his hands like treasure, while the others whisper about hiding places and tricks for the overseers. Mainstream fact. Children made up nearly a third of workhouse populations. Many were orphans, others abandoned by parents who couldn't feed them. Officially, the workhouse was meant to teach discipline and moral habits. In reality, many grew up more cunning than disciplined, learning to stretch rules, sneak food, and carve little pockets of joy where they could. One older girl, maybe 12, though she looks 8, produces a stub of chalk from her apron. She squats down and scrawls something across the wall. At first, you think it's nonsense, until you tilt your head and see a lopsided sketch of the master, complete with enormous nose and donkey ears. The other children clap their hands over their mouths to keep from giggling. Here's a quirky tidbit. There are reports of workhouse kids sneaking into the kitchens to liberate potato peelings, or even gnawing on candle stubs made of tallow. One historian recorded a story of children daring each other to lick the brass doorknobs because they believed it might give them strength. Historians still argue whether these stories were exaggerated by later critics or genuine glimpses of how children invented their own survival games. The group suddenly goes still. An overseer rounds the corner, boots echoing. The children scatter like sparrows, some vanishing into the laundry room, others ducking behind the pump. Only the chalk drawing remains, mockery carved on the wall in white lines. The overseer squints, steps closer, then growls and spits on it, rubbing it away with his sleeve. But you see the smallest boy grinning from his hiding place, pleased that their little rebellion left a mark, however fleeting. You follow him later through the narrow corridor that leads to the schoolroom. There, rows of wooden benches face a blackboard. The master drones on about scripture and sums, voice flat, while the children's eyes wander toward the window. They aren't daydreaming of better sums. They're plotting. One girl scratches something into the wood of her bench with a pin. You lean closer. Sally was here. A message to the future. Proof that she existed beyond the ledger's numbers. Their rebellion isn't loud. It doesn't topple walls or storm gates. It's quieter. Sharing crusts of bread under the blanket, drawing donkeys on the wall, scratching names into wood. Yet, in a place built to erase individuality, those small acts are thunderous. You close your eyes for a moment, listening to their muffled laughter echo down the hall. And you can't help but smile, because even here, under the crushing weight of rules and hunger, children still find ways to break free, if only for a heartbeat. You hear the clang before you see it, that metallic heartbeat of Victorian ambition. The workhouse yard gives way to a long shed filled with mechanical beasts, iron frames, belts, and wheels that hiss and grind like angry serpents. You step inside, and the air changes immediately. Dust swirls thick. The smell of oil mixes with wet cloth, and the floor hums with constant vibration. This is the industrial wing of the workhouse, where machines swallow up children's hands and spit out thread. Once, the poor law guardians insisted that workhouses shouldn't compete with honest trades. Yet, by the mid-19th century, some were filled with machinery borrowed from factories, the lines between relief and profit blurring until nobody could quite say which came first. You approach a loom taller than you, its wooden frame rattling with every shuttle. A boy, barely 10, stands on tiptoe to keep the threads aligned. His fingers move quick as spiders darting in to fix a break. One wrong move, and the shuttle might crack his knuckles, or worse. A cough escapes him, sharp, raspy. Cotton dust coats his lips like flour. You feel your own throat tighten just watching. Here's the mainstream fact. In some London workhouses, inmates were set to labor at oakum picking, stone breaking, and textile production. Oakum, the endless task of unraveling old ship ropes, was particularly notorious, leaving fingers raw and bleeding. Stone breaking was worse, crushing bodies meant to be mended. Yet, with the Industrial Revolution pressing at every door, textile work crept in, and machinery followed. The master struts through the rows, boots tapping like a metronome. He doesn't look at the children so much as through them, checking output, not faces. His cane wraps the side of a loom, and the boy flinches, speeding up his hands. You realize the rhythm of this room isn't set by lungs or hearts. It's by the machine. Quirky tidbit. One visitor in the 1840s claimed that some workhouse inmates grew oddly fond of the machines. The steady clatter, he wrote, was soothing, like rain upon the roof. Hard to believe when you watch a girl's braid nearly sucked into the gears before she jerks back in terror. But maybe, when everything else is silence and scolding, even the hammering of machinery feels like company. Historians still argue whether such comments reflected genuine inmate sentiment or the visitor's own desperate attempt to romanticize misery. You walk deeper, noticing how the air grows heavier with every step. Bits of lint drift through the sunlight, turning the rays into cloudy columns. Your skin itches, your eyes sting, and then you remember something darkly practical. Workhouse managers didn't care much about ventilation because inmates weren't supposed to stay healthy. The logic was twisted. If you got stronger, you might not leave. In one corner, you find a pile of half-finished cloth stacked on a wooden pallet. The edges are crooked, threads dangling like loose nerves. Someone whispers that the workers here sometimes weave little patterns into the cloth, tiny symbols hidden in the warp and weft. Not enough to ruin the piece, but enough to leave a mark. A crude heart, a crooked star, the letter of a name. The masters rarely noticed, but the children knew, and those symbols meant everything. The noise grows unbearable. You raise your voice in your own head just to think. And yet, when the bell finally clangs to mark the end of the shift, you see no relief on their faces, just more exhaustion layered onto what was already there. They shuffle out, eyes down, backs bent, leaving behind the monsters of wood and iron still twitching as if hungry for more. You trail behind them, back into the courtyard, lungs grateful for the cold night. But the machines stay with you, their rhythm etched into your skull, their hunger still rattling in your chest. And you realize, in a city that prided itself on progress, the workhouse had become a place where the poor were fed not on bread, but into machines themselves. The clang fades, but not the feeling. You step into another wing of the workhouse where the silence is stranger than the noise you just escaped. Here, it isn't machines that rule, it's rules. Walls lined with notices, each one stamped with authority, each one another brick in the invisible prison. You stop at the first board. Bold black letters declare, "Silence must be maintained at all times." A simple line, but heavier than any stone you've lifted. Imagine living day after day without the right to whisper, laugh, or sigh without fear of punishment. One woman once wrote that silence in the workhouse was more suffocating than hunger. You don't doubt her. The master appears again, clutching a ledger. He checks your posture, your hands, even your shoes. Nothing escapes. Because the rules here are more than suggestions. They're the air you breathe. You step too slowly? That's insubordination. Take too long with your meal? Wastefulness. Look another inmate in the eye for too long? Conspiracy. Here's the mainstream fact. The new poor law workhouses were deliberately designed to be strict. Guardians argued that less eligibility was necessary. Conditions inside had to be worse than any outside job, otherwise people might choose the workhouse over employment. So rules multiplied like weeds, each one designed to keep inmates miserable enough to leave if they could. But of course, many couldn't, so they lived by those rules as if carved in their own skin. You glance at another board. Meals shall be consumed in silence. A memory rises, the dining hall, long benches, bowls of watery broth. No chatter, no clinking of spoons beyond what's unavoidable. just hundreds of bodies eating as if inside a cathedral of hunger. Some scholars still argue whether the silence rule was ever strictly enforced in every workhouse, or if it was more of a threat than a daily reality. Either way, the chill it left in the air was real enough. Quirky tidbit. Some clever inmates found loopholes. In one London workhouse, women began tapping spoons lightly against the edge of their bowls to pass coded messages. A tap, a pause, another tap. Just enough to mean, I see you. I'm here. The masters noticed eventually, of course, but the habit spread like an underground song. Imagine Morse code, but with porridge. You walk further and come across another terrifying rule. Families shall be separated upon admission. That one hurts most. You picture parents arriving with children only to be split into different wards. Husbands and wives divided, children sorted by age. The rule was cold, efficient, and devastating. Workhouses weren't built for love. They were built for order. A woman passes you, eyes lowered, clutching a small scrap of paper in her hand. You catch a glimpse. Numbers, nothing more. But to her, that scrap is sacred. It's her child's workhouse number. Names weren't always used here. You became a figure in a ledger, a tally on the wall. Some parents memorize their children's numbers like prayers, reciting them to themselves each night to keep the bond alive. You pause at another board. The master's decision is final. And you realize just how fragile everyone's existence is inside. The rules are already suffocating, but beyond them stands a man whose whims could bend them. Some masters were fairer than others, but plenty relished their power. Historians still argue whether the cruelty of workhouse masters reflected individual sadism or simply the inevitable result of a system designed to punish. The walls feel closer now. You imagine yourself here, trying to live with every breath monitored, every word forbidden, every choice stripped. How long would you last? A week? A day? You probably wouldn't survive the first hour without whispering something sarcastic, though in truth that joke would have cost you your dinner. And so, rules ruled everything. They were the bars without iron, the chains without weight, the silence without peace. Even now, reading them on faded boards, you can hear them pressing down, turning people into shadows of themselves. You linger in the corridor, where the boards of rules hang like commandments, but eventually you drift into another memory, carried by the walls. Not everyone obeyed. Not everyone stayed. Behind the iron discipline of the workhouse, there pulsed a quieter, more dangerous rhythm, the stubborn wish to escape. At night, when the dormitory was silent except for the coughs and restless shifts of 100 bodies, whispers floated like smoke. There's a way out. Imagine you lying there, muscles aching from stone breaking, eyes burning from soap fumes, and then those 4 words. They land in your chest like sparks in dry hay. Escape attempts happen more often than you'd think. The walls weren't impossibly high, but they bristled with deterrents. Jagged shards of glass cemented into the top, iron spikes, and of course the watchful eyes of porters. Yet some tried anyway. One story, often repeated, though historians still argue whether it really occurred, told of a boy knotting bedsheets together and lowering himself down the outer wall. Another tale described a woman sneaking into the laundry carts, hidden under stiff linen, rolled straight out the gate like contraband cloth. Whether myth or memory, the stories became currency, passed along in whispers to remind everyone that walls, however tall, were not invincible. Daytime escapes were riskier, but sometimes more successful. Workhouse inmates were occasionally sent out on errands, collecting coal, fetching supplies, assisting with parish tasks. You picture yourself with a sack of flour in your arms, the cold London fog licking your cheeks, and the street opening before you like a promise. All you'd need to do is take one step left instead of right. Some did. They vanished into the alleys, into the crowded markets, into the anonymity of London itself. Of course, survival afterward wasn't guaranteed. Many who ran had no money, no contacts, and quickly starved. Still, the gamble seemed worth it compared to the grind within. A quirky tidbit. Certain workhouses kept meticulous deserters' registers. Every runaway was logged like a stolen item. One entry notes a man leaving barefoot, armed with nothing but a broken spoon. Another mentions a 12-year-old girl who bolted not once but 3 times, always found near her mother, who was confined to the women's ward. You can't help but grin at her persistence. If rebellion had a mascot, it might be that stubborn child clutching her mother's skirt. Then there were soft escapes, ways people broke free without climbing walls. Some feigned illness, hoping to be transferred to hospitals where oversight was looser. Others petitioned parish guardians endlessly, begging for reconsideration. Occasionally, those petitions worked. It's almost comical. Men who'd been trapped by endless rules finally wriggled out through a loophole of paperwork. Historians debate whether this counted as escape at all. Was it really rebellion if you begged your jailer for permission? But to the men and women who walked free, it must have felt like victory. Children, too, dreamed of escape. In schoolrooms, boys stared out of soot-smeared windows, their slates ignored, imagining running across fields. Some actually tried, sprinting when teachers turned away. The smallest were usually caught within minutes, but a few slipped into the fog, their tiny feet swallowed by the labyrinth of alleys. One inspector wrote of the plague of absconding children, as if their urge to run were an illness instead of a perfectly reasonable reaction to captivity. But not all escapes required movement. Inmates carved initials into wooden benches, scratched words into stone lintels, or hummed forbidden songs while scrubbing pots. Imagination itself was a ladder. One elderly man later recalled that every night, lying on the hard cot, he'd picture walking across open fields. He described every step, every hedgerow, until the dawn bell rang. He survived by escaping through his mind. And maybe that's the ultimate point. Walls can trap bodies, but not thoughts. Punishment, of course, waited for those who failed. Recaptured runaways often endured solitary confinement, cold cells with nothing but a stool. Others had meals reduced or were paraded before fellow inmates as warnings. The cruelest punishment, though, wasn't material. It was hopelessness. Once caught, the walls seemed taller, the air heavier. Some stopped trying altogether, convinced that even daring to dream of freedom would only break them further. Yet hope never vanished completely. There are records of men who escaped once, failed, tried again, and failed again, until finally, on the 3rd attempt, they succeeded. One story describes a man who scaled the wall, fell, shattered his leg, was dragged back, and yet a year later hobbled out the gates and never returned. His persistence became legend. Historians still debate the broader meaning of these escapes. Were they isolated acts of desperation, Or do they hint at a quiet, widespread rebellion against the very concept of the workhouse? The official narrative painted workhouses as benevolent shelters. But every scratch of initials, every knotted bedsheet, every vanished child whispers the same truth. No matter how strict the system, human beings are not built for cages. And when you think about it, you feel the pull yourself. As you walk the narrow corridors in your imagination, you can almost sense the temptation to run toward the doors, through the fog, into the endless, terrifying freedom beyond. Maybe you'd fail. Maybe you'd starve. But at least you'd be free. You wander further into the long shadow of the workhouse and begin to notice something strange. The buildings were not only designed to feed or confine, but to humiliate. Shame wasn't an accident of the system. It was a feature. From the moment you entered, your clothes were stripped away and replaced with uniforms. Itchy, shapeless garments meant to erase individuality. You can almost feel the coarse fabric on your skin now, stiff as sandpaper, smelling faintly of lye. Men wore sack-like trousers and jackets, women shapeless dresses. Children were indistinguishable from one another, lined up in rows like tiny soldiers of poverty. It wasn't enough to be poor, you had to look poor, instantly recognizable if you dared to step outside the gate. The architecture itself reinforced the message. Tall gates, looming facades, endless corridors, all conveyed power. Workhouse boards hung rules in every corridor. Silence at meals. Obey without question. No contact between sexes. You read them and feel the same tightening in your chest you might feel in a strict classroom. Except here, the rules governed not hours, but entire lives. A curious fact, many workhouses were deliberately built with their main entrances facing parish high streets. That way, townsfolk could watch paupers shuffle in. It was theater, a civic warning. This is where idleness leads. Some guardians even discussed the deterrent effect openly in minutes of meetings. In other words, humiliation wasn't collateral damage, it was policy. A tidbit less often discussed. Some institutions went so far as to separate children from parents immediately at the gate, not just to enforce efficiency, but to maximize the psychological sting. Imagine arriving destitute, clutching your child's hand and being told, "No, not together. He belongs there. You belong here." Children cried, parents begged, but the rules held. Even those moments of resistance were woven into the design of shame. Punishments carried the same flavor. Inmates caught breaking rules were sometimes made to sit in silence in the yard, a sign pinned to their chest proclaiming disobedient. Others were assigned deliberately degrading tasks, scrubbing privies, picking oakum until their fingers bled. There are records of men being forced to parade with buckets on their backs, a mockery staged for others to see. Historians debate how effective this system of humiliation truly was. On one side, some argue that it worked as intended. Workhouse populations did remain relatively low because many of the poor dreaded entering at all. On the other side, critics point out that shame corrodes communities. Families who entered often never recovered socially, marked forever as workhouse people. There are accounts of children bullied in schools decades later because their parents had once been confined. The debate circles endlessly. Was the shame a deterrent or simply cruelty disguised as policy? Consider how it felt to be inspected. Workhouse inmates were subject to weekly medical checks, their bodies assessed for cleanliness, their behavior noted. Imagine standing in line, stripped to your shift, while a doctor lifted your chin, checked your teeth, scribbled into a ledger. Not only were you poor, now you were cataloged like livestock. Some reports describe inmates trembling under these inspections, their dignity peeled away like onion skin. And yet, in the midst of all this engineered humiliation, people sometimes carved out defiance. Women stitched secret patterns into their uniforms. Men nicknamed the rules the 10 Commandments of Misery. Children turned the inspection line into a game of pulling faces when the doctor looked away. These small rebellions didn't undo the shame, but they diluted it, like slipping honey into bitter tea. What strikes you, walking through these remembered corridors, is how modern the tactics feel. Public shaming as deterrent, surveillance as discipline, forced uniformity as control. These are not relics locked in the 19th century. You wonder how much of that machinery lingers around us still, dressed in subtler clothes. And maybe that's the most haunting lesson of all. The workhouse was not simply a building. It was a theater of shame, a stage where poverty itself was punished, not with whips or chains, but with humiliation so systematic it could break the soul as surely as hunger broke the body. Even inside walls built for control, people find ways to push back. You start to notice that the workhouse wasn't a place of total silence. It hummed with quiet acts of defiance, the sort that didn't make it into official reports, but whispered through oral histories and memoirs. Resistance didn't always look like uprisings, though those happened. In a few parishes, inmates staged strikes, refusing to work until food rations improved. Imagine dozens of men and women sitting in the yard, arms folded, ignoring the overseer's shouts. Records say such revolts were quickly crushed, extra punishments handed down, ringleaders thrown into solitary. But the fact they erupted at all shows that even here, fear couldn't erase anger. More often, defiance was subtle. Children sang songs mocking the master under their breath. Women deliberately mismeasured ingredients so the thin stew tasted a little less watery. Men working in the stone-breaking yards tapped rhythms with their hammers, secret Morse codes of solidarity. You can almost hear the faint clangs carrying messages no guard could decipher. One quirky fact: some inmates developed coded languages made from gestures and sounds, allowing them to communicate during mandatory silences. A cough might mean bread. A scrape of a boot could mean meeting after dark. Like prisoners of war decades later, they invented entire shadow languages beneath the noses of their overseers. Historians still argue whether these tiny rebellions had any lasting effect. Some say they were mere survival tricks, sparks in a storm that quickly died out. Others argue they mattered profoundly, keeping dignity alive, reminding people that even in cages, the human spirit insists on its freedom. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. There were also outright escapes, not frequent. The walls were high, the punishment severe, but real enough to spark gossip. One case tells of a man scaling a boundary wall during a storm, rain muffling the sound of his footsteps. Another tale, half legend, half documented, claims a group of children once wriggled through a coal chute, vanishing into the night. Most who fled were eventually caught, dragged back, their punishment made public to terrify others. Yet each attempt sent a ripple of hope through those still inside. It's possible. Defiance could even appear in religion. Hymns were twisted into parodies, prayers muttered under breath, included lines not in any book, pleas for freedom, curses at the guardians. Faith was both solace and rebellion, a reminder that no earthly board of guardians had the last word, and sometimes resistance was quiet refusal. A man who worked slower than demanded, forcing the overseer to shout. A woman who looked a matron straight in the eye rather than bowing her head. Tiny gestures, but in a place designed to break individuality, they meant everything. As you walk through these echoes, you realize resistance is never about victory alone. It's about refusing to let cruelty write the whole story. Each cough code, each crooked hymn, each runaway child was a thread of humanity, stubbornly woven into a system built to unravel it. And in that persistence, you hear something stronger than rules, gates, or ledgers. The reminder that people do not surrender their dignity easily. Even in a workhouse, the spark of rebellion flickers, small, fragile, yet impossible to fully extinguish. You've followed the rattle of keys, the clang of gates, the creak of stone floors, and the mutters of the hungry. But stepping out of the last corridor, you realize the workhouse doesn't end when the doors shut. Its shadow stretches far beyond Victorian London, spilling into the world you live in now. When Parliament finally dismantled the system in the early 20th century, the bricks didn't vanish overnight. Many workhouse buildings were repurposed into hospitals, asylums, or public offices. Some still stand today, their grim outlines softened by ivy and glass windows, but their walls carry echoes. Patients receiving care in those converted hospitals often never realized the beds once held the undeserving poor. It's unsettling to think healing rose out of spaces built for discipline. The stigma didn't fade quickly either. For generations, the word workhouse carried venom. Families avoided speaking of ancestors who endured them. Children whose grandparents had been inside sometimes hid the truth, ashamed of being tied to poverty's emblem. Even today, phrases like "back to the workhouse" survive in language, ghostly reminders of a system officially gone but never fully buried. One mainstream fact: some of Britain's major hospitals, including parts of London's health infrastructure, literally grew out of workhouse infirmaries. What began as punishment wings became stepping stones for modern medicine. Then there are the quirky, half-forgotten traces. In a few English towns, folklore claims that at midnight you can hear phantom bells calling inmates to supper or catch the faint smell of thin gruel drifting across cobblestones. Are these stories true? Probably not. But it says something that the workhouse imprinted itself so deeply that locals still conjure its presence more than a century later. Historians still argue whether the workhouse legacy was ultimately constructive or corrosive. Did it lay groundwork for a universal welfare state, forcing Britain to eventually recognize that caring for the poor required compassion, not punishment? Or did it set back social progress by decades, normalizing cruelty and leaving scars of mistrust that slowed reform? The debate remains alive in lecture halls and bookshelves, with no neat resolution. You, standing here, sense both truths pressing together. On one hand, the workhouse system feels like a lesson carved in stone. This is what happens when bureaucracy forgets the human heart. On the other, its failure may have paved the way for something better. Without the outcry against its harshness, would later reforms, free school meals, national insurance, the welfare state, have ever arrived? As your steps carry you away from the last echo, you notice how the narrative arcs back to today. Modern welfare debates, questions of who deserves help, how society defines fairness, still echo with Victorian undertones. The workhouse may be gone, but the arguments linger. What you carry from this journey isn't just the memory of stone walls and meager rations. It's the recognition that societies are always balancing mercy against suspicion, generosity against fear of being cheated. The Victorians built walls out of that fear. The challenge for us is not to build new ones, invisible, but just as cold. The long shadow of the workhouse reminds you, history doesn't sleep. It hums beneath your streets, behind your hospitals, in the very language people still use without thinking. And as you breathe out, the question lingers softly. Will we do better with our own shadows? And now, at the end of this long, winding path through Victorian London's workhouses, you can finally let the noise fade. The clang of the gates, the shuffle of boots, the groan of tired bodies, all of it recedes into quiet. What remains is only a gentle hum, like distant rain on rooftops. You've walked through stone corridors and drafty wards, felt the hunger of thin gruel and the weight of endless routine. You've also brushed against strange details, odd corners of history, and debates that still circle in hushed academic voices. But here, right now, none of that asks for your attention. All it asks is that you rest. Let the images soften. Those harsh beds dissolve into clouds. The dim lantern light blurs into a warm glow. The echoing bells become no more than a whisper, steady and comforting. You've carried the story to its end, and now you can set it down like a heavy book, closing the cover with care. Notice your breath, steady and quiet. Notice how the tension eases out of your shoulders. You don't need to picture brick walls or locked gates anymore. Instead, imagine wide open fields, cool evening air, and the calm of knowing the journey is complete. The past has a way of staying with us, but tonight you've given it enough space. Let it rest in its century while you rest in yours. The workhouse fades, the streets fall silent, and you are left with nothing but calm. So close your eyes, drift with the rhythm of your breathing, and let the final traces of Victorian London slip away into the night. Sleep deeply and carry only peace into your dreams.